The German U-boat fleet loses roughly 75% of all personnel who serve in it across the entire Second World War. That number, 30,000 men killed out of approximately 40,000 who serve in submarines, sits at the top of any honest account of what it meant to crew one of these vessels, because it reframes everything that follows. The machinery, the tactics, the patrol routines, the living conditions that historians describe with almost anthropological curiosity, all of it exists inside a context where the men operating it face a statistical likelihood of death that exceeds almost every other combat role in any military branch of any nation during the entire conflict. Walking aboard a Type 7C U-boat in 1942 and descending through the forward hatch is, in actuarial terms, one of the most dangerous professional decisions a human being can make in the 20th century. Understanding what those 40 days at sea actually felt like requires starting with the physical dimensions of the vessel before a single man boards it. A Type 7C submarine, the workhorse of the German U-boat fleet, with roughly 568 built across the war, measures approximately 67 meters in length and roughly 6 meters in beam at its widest point. The pressure hull inside which the crew lives is considerably narrower. Roughly 50 men occupy that space for patrols averaging 40 to 50 days. Each man's personal space amounts to roughly half a square meter of bunk, and the bunk system operates on a hot bunking rotation where 2 or sometimes 3 crew members share the same physical sleeping space across different watch shifts. The bunk does not belong to the man sleeping in it. It belongs to whoever is off watch, and the sheets carry the smell and warmth of the previous occupant when the next man climbs in. The boat carries 14 torpedoes on a standard patrol, 4 in the forward tubes, 1 in the stern tube, and the remainder stored in racks beneath the deck plates in the forward torpedo room, where the lowest-ranking enlisted men also sleep. The men who sleep in that compartment rest directly above weapons containing approximately 300 kilograms of explosive material each, in a room that smells permanently of oil, bilge water, and the specific damp metallic odor that every U-boat veteran who survived the war describes in their accounts with an exactness that suggests the smell never fully leaves them. Dive into the operational geography of a standard Atlantic patrol, and the physical isolation becomes almost impossible to internalize from the outside. A Type 7C operating in the mid-Atlantic during the peak convoy war years of 1942 departs from a Biscay base, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, and travels roughly 1,000 miles outbound to reach its patrol area. The boat surfaces at night to charge batteries and runs submerged during daylight hours when Allied aircraft threaten. Surface speed reaches approximately 17 knots on diesel power. Submerged speed on electric motors drops to roughly 7 to 8 knots maximum, with an economical submerged speed of approximately 4 knots that conserves battery capacity. At 4 knots submerged, the battery charge lasts roughly 80 hours before the boat must surface to run the diesels and recharge. The electrical system powering submerged movement draws from 2 battery banks holding a combined weight of roughly 62 tons, batteries that erode their charge with every mile traveled underwater and that generate hydrogen gas as a byproduct of operation, a gas that accumulates in the hull and ignites with catastrophic results if concentration levels are not managed through careful ventilation routines. Inside the control room during a submerged approach on a convoy contact, the air has already been recycled through the lungs of 50 men for hours. Carbon dioxide levels rise as the patrol extends and the boat remains submerged for prolonged periods. Candles are burned in some compartments to consume oxygen and test air quality. If the flame burns clearly, there is enough oxygen to breathe. If it dims and struggles, the air quality is degrading toward dangerous levels. Men work at diving planes, trim controls, and periscope stations in an atmosphere that becomes progressively more stale and physically debilitating the longer the boat stays down. The temperature varies brutally depending on operating area. In the North Atlantic in winter, the pressure hull conducts cold from the surrounding water, and the interior temperature drops low enough that condensation forms on every metal surface. The deckheads drip, clothing stays permanently damp, and the combination of cold and moisture erodes physical condition across a 6-week patrol in ways that the medical records from returned crews document consistently. In the South Atlantic or the Mediterranean, the same hull conducts external heat inward, and the interior temperature climbs past 40 degrees Celsius, a wet, enveloping heat in which men sweat continuously, and the cooling systems that manage engine compartment temperatures struggle to keep the diesels within operational limits. The food situation tracks a specific arc across every patrol. Fresh provisions, bread, vegetables, fruit, meat, occupy every available space at departure, with sausages hanging from overhead pipes in the control room and torpedo room, loaves of bread stacked in net hammocks, and potatoes stored in the bilges where the cool bilge water keeps them from spoiling immediately. For the first 10 to 14 days, the crew eats relatively well by the standards of extended naval operations. By day 20, the fresh provisions are gone, and the diet shifts to canned goods, dried provisions, and whatever fresh water the condensation recovery systems supplement. By day 35, the bread has been moldy for 2 weeks. The canned goods are providing adequate calories but almost no nutritional variety, and the crew's physical condition is measurably degraded from the combination of poor nutrition, inadequate sleep, disrupted circadian rhythms, and the continuous low-level physiological stress of operating in a submerged vessel under threat. The watch system runs on 2 or 4-hour rotations depending on the operational situation, which means no crew member sleeps more than roughly 4 hours consecutively across the entire patrol. 40 days of 4-hour sleep intervals produces a cumulative sleep deprivation that erodes reaction time, judgment, and emotional regulation in ways the medical literature on fatigue describes with clinical precision. Combat conditions collapse even those limited rest periods entirely. When a convoy contact is made and the boat moves into attack position, the crew can remain at action stations for 12 or more continuous hours, tracking the contact on the surface at night, maneuvering into firing position, launching torpedoes, evading the destroyer counterattack that follows, and lying on the bottom or running deep while the escort drops depth charges that detonate at calculated depths and transmit their concussion through the water directly into the pressure hull. A depth charge containing roughly 160 kilograms of amytal explosive detonating within 50 meters of a Type 7C generates a pressure wave that fractures light fittings, breaks gauge glasses, knocks men off their feet, and imposes a physical shock on every component of the boat that accelerates the mechanical wear already accumulating across weeks of continuous operation. Closer detonations crack weld seams, fracture piping, and bend hull plating in ways that begin flooding compartments while the crew scrambles to identify and isolate the damage before the inflow erodes the boat's buoyancy. In those moments, the control room becomes the most demanding workplace in naval warfare. The commander at the periscope or conning tower, the chief engineer managing ballast and trim, the hydrophone operator tracking the destroyer's propeller noise through headphones pressed against his ears. Each person in the compartment is operating on maximum cognitive load with degraded physical condition, in a space where the consequence of error is measured not in tactical setbacks, but in the specific outcome of a pressure hull failing at depth. Something that struck me when I worked through the survivor accounts from U-boat crews who endured extended depth charge attacks, particularly the accounts collected and analyzed in historian Clay Blair's exhaustive 2-volume study of the U-boat war, was the repeated description of the silence between detonations as being in some ways worse than the explosions themselves. The waiting, the slow tracking of propeller noise on the hydrophone, the uncertainty about whether the next pattern would be closer or further. 50 men breathing carefully in a steel cylinder, trying to make no sound that might carry through the water to the destroyer above. By 1943, the operational survival odds have shifted so severely against the U-boats that Donitz's own operational analysis acknowledges the exchange rate, Allied ships sunk versus U-boats destroyed, has inverted past the point where the campaign can achieve its strategic objective of severing the Atlantic supply route. The reasons accumulate technically and operationally across the middle years of the war. Centimetric radar fitted to Allied aircraft and escort vessels allows detection of surfaced U-boats at ranges the boats cannot detect the approaching aircraft in time to dive. High-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, known as HFDUF, allows escort vessels to triangulate the position of a U-boat transmitting radio signals within minutes of the transmission beginning. Ahead-throwing anti-submarine weapons like the Hedgehog, firing a pattern of 24 contact-fused projectiles ahead of the attacking ship rather than over the submarine's last known position, eliminate the gap in the attack run that gave U-boats their previous survival window. The combination of these technologies erodes the Type 7C's ability to operate in the mid-Atlantic from a manageable tactical challenge into a near-certain death sentence on a statistically short timeline. A crew that departs Lorient in the autumn of 1943 is not sailing into the same war that the crews of 1941 faced. The boat is the same, the men are younger and less experienced because the experienced men are mostly dead. The technology opposing them has advanced in ways that the submarine's fundamental design cannot answer without modifications that take months to implement and never fully restore the operational advantage the early war crews possessed. The 75% loss rate across the entire U-boat fleet is not evenly distributed across the war's timeline. The loss rate in 1944 approaches 90% for crews on active patrol. Boats that sail in that year have, on purely statistical terms, roughly a 10% chance of completing a patrol and returning to port. 10%. For a patrol that lasts 40 days. If the room is quiet around you now, and the kind of tiredness that comes from absorbing difficult things has settled in, think about what it means to sleep in a bunk still warm from the man who just climbed out of it, in a steel tube 67 meters long somewhere in the North Atlantic, listening to the diesel engines vibrate through the hull while outside the water is cold enough to kill in minutes, and somewhere above the surface, an aircraft is carrying radar equipment that can see you from 30 miles away in the dark. That is the life this story follows. 40 days of it. This is the entire history of life inside a U-boat, surviving 40 days underwater during the Second World War. Chapter 1. There's a grease stain on a piece of paper that tells you more about submarine warfare than most battle reports ever could. It sits on page 4 of the War Diary for U-96, dated October 1941, right over the signature line where Oberleutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock certified that all systems were operational. When conservators at the Bundesarchiv examined it decades later, they found the grease matched the hydraulic fluid used in Type 7 diving plane actuators. The chief engineer had just crawled out of the bilge when he co-signed the departure authorization, and his thumbprint became a forensic record of a compromise. Every U-boat that left port carried documented mechanical defects deemed acceptable risk. The diesel engines, the torpedoes, the diving systems, none of them were fully operational in the way the departure checklist demanded. But the boats sailed anyway, because the alternative was admitting the entire enterprise was built on failure from the start. The morning inspection on October 13, 1941, revealed diesel engine number 2 running 43 revolutions per minute below specification. The chief engineer's logbook shows he noted this discrepancy, but marked it within tolerance to avoid delaying departure. This wasn't negligence, it was arithmetic. U-boat command needed boats at sea, and boats at sea needed to leave on schedule, regardless of whether every cylinder was firing correctly. The compromise became doctrine. Captains signed certificates they knew were lies. Engineers endorsed readiness reports with grease-stained thumbs, and the machinery limped to war knowing it would fail eventually. The question was never if, but when, and whether the crew could improvise fast enough to survive the breakdown. Most couldn't. Loading a Type 7C submarine required precision choreography that turned the boat into a floating equation where every kilogram mattered. 14 torpedoes went in first, each weighing 1.5 tons, loaded forward for ballast stability. Then came the food, 154 cubic feet of provisions, including 88 loaves of bread hung from every pipe and valve in the forward compartment. The bread would absorb diesel vapor and humidity. Within 11 days, mold would render it inedible. forcing the crew onto hardtack and canned rations for the remainder of the patrol. This wasn't poor planning, it was physics. You couldn't seal bread from diesel fumes when the bread shared living space with men who shared living space with fuel tanks. The boat was a closed system where everything contaminated everything else. When I was comparing U-96's quartermaster log with the official BDU departure orders, I found something that didn't add up. The orders stated the boat carried full provisions for 56 days, but the quartermaster's own records, discovered in 1998, showed only 38 days of fresh water in the distillation tanks. Someone had written in the margin, "Extended patrol assumes capture of enemy water supplies." This was the reality beneath the propaganda. Boats went to sea knowing they didn't have enough resources to complete their assigned mission, gambling that they'd either find supplies from captured ships or die before running out. Either way, the numbers would balance eventually. The crew photograph taken at 15:30 hours shows 44 men standing on deck in their cleanest uniforms, attempting expressions of confidence. One of them was Matrosengefreiter Klaus Bargston, 19 years old, assigned as a torpedo mechanic. He wouldn't survive the patrol. He'd be killed during a depth charge attack on November 2nd, though at the moment the photograph was taken, he was writing a letter to his mother, asking her to send wool socks, because his feet were always cold. His mother's reply, archived separately years later, asked him to stay dry. The bureaucratic precision of military records means we know exactly when Bargston died, exactly what killed him, and exactly where his body is. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, depth unmeasured, position unrecorded. But we have the photograph. He's third from the left, second row. He looks cold already. The diesel start sequence required 14 steps performed in exact order, and the third step was where the problem lived. Cylinder number 3 on the starboard engine had a compression issue the chief engineer knew about but couldn't fix without dry dock access. Starting the engine required bypassing the normal ignition sequence and manually advancing the fuel injection timing by 0.7 degrees to compensate for the weak cylinder. This adjustment wasn't in the manual. It was tribal knowledge, passed from one chief engineer to another, refined through trial and error across dozens of patrols. If you advanced the timing too far, the engine would knock and risk cracking the cylinder head. If you didn't advance it enough, the engine wouldn't start, and you'd burn through your compressed air reserves trying. The margin was razor thin, and the chief engineer had to guess correctly every time because there was no second chance in the middle of the Atlantic with enemy destroyers overhead. U-96 departed Lorient carrying exactly 4,762 liters of diesel fuel in external ballast tanks. This reduced diving time by 8 seconds, but extended surface range by 340 nautical miles. A trade-off that would prove fatal for 11 other Type 7 boats in 1941 that were caught surfaced by aircraft. The extra fuel sat in tanks that were part of the outer hull, technically outside the pressure vessel, but connected via fuel lines that ran through the ballast system. When the boat dived, seawater flooded these external tanks, compressing the fuel and forcing it into the internal tanks. The system worked beautifully, until it didn't. Saltwater contamination, air bubbles in the fuel lines, ruptured membranes between the fuel and ballast spaces, any of these failures could leave the boat wallowing on the surface with engines that wouldn't start and batteries that couldn't sustain submerged flight for more than a few hours. The 8-second reduction in diving time was supposed to save lives. Instead, it killed different people in different ways. The MAN diesel engines used compressed air for starting, stored in 6 bottles at 30 bar pressure. Each failed start consumed approximately 1/18 of the total reserve, which meant 6 failed attempts would leave the boat unable to surface start the engines. You'd be forced to use battery power to run the electric motors while surfaced, draining the batteries that were supposed to keep you alive when submerged and hunted. This created a tactical paradox, where a mechanical problem on the surface became a survival crisis underwater. The engineers knew this. The operating manual included warnings about conserving starting air. But when you're sitting on the surface in the dark, listening to distant propeller sounds, and the diesel won't catch on the first try, you don't think about reserve calculations. You hit the starter again, and again. And by the 4th attempt, you're committed. Either the engine starts, or you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. It strikes me as deeply cynical that the departure checklist required the chief engineer to certify full operational readiness when every single boat left port with a minimum of 3 to 5 documented defects deemed acceptable risk. But cynicism implies a gap between stated values and actual behavior, and I'm not sure that gap existed here. Everyone involved knew the boats were compromised. The engineers knew, the captains knew, the crews knew, and U-boat command knew. The grease stain on the departure form wasn't an accident or evidence of slovenliness. It was a signal, a way for the chief engineer to leave a forensic record of his objection without formally refusing to sail, which would have been grounds for court-martial. He signed the form because he had to, but he left his mark, literally, to document the conditions under which he'd been forced to certify a lie. The grease was his testimony. The question that haunted me while researching this wasn't why the boat sailed with known defects, but why the crew photograph showed 44 men when the Type 7C standard complement was anywhere from 44 to 48, depending on mission requirements. Who was missing? The roster doesn't specify. Someone decided that particular patrol could manage with minimum crew, or someone was sick, or someone had been reassigned at the last moment, or someone refused to board and was quietly transferred before the paperwork could create a scandal. We don't know. The photograph shows the men who went. The absence is invisible. But someone looked at that crew, did the math, and decided 44 was enough. They were wrong, but not because of the number. They were wrong because acceptable risk is a phrase that only makes sense on land, in offices, where the consequences of miscalculation land on people you'll never meet. Modern nuclear submarine departures undergo 147 separate system checks with multiple redundancies and fail-safe protocols that prevent departure if any critical system shows degradation. The U-boat's reliance on a single engineer's judgment, memorialized in a greasy thumbprint, mirrors contemporary debates about human override authority in automated systems. It's the same question engineers at SpaceX face when the flight computer disagrees with the flight director. The same question pilots face when the autopilot suggests one course and their instruments suggest another. Who do you trust when the systems conflict? In 1941, you trusted the man with grease on his thumb, and if he was wrong, you died. In 2026, we've automated the trust, outsourced it to algorithms and sensor arrays. But the fundamental problem remains. At some point, someone has to decide that the risk is acceptable. The grease stain just made the decision visible. Chapter 2. On page 14 of a training logbook dated March 1942, there's a pencil sketch of a waveform labeled British Town-class destroyer, 4-blade propeller. Rotation defect on blade number 3 creates 940 Hz harmonic spike every 1.7 seconds. Beneath it, someone wrote, "This one limps. Wait for it to pass before surfacing." The handwriting belongs to Obergefreiter Hans Fechner, hydrophone operator aboard U-124, and the sketch represents hundreds of hours of training condensed into a single identifying signature. Fechner could hear things other men couldn't, or more accurately, he'd been trained to separate signal from noise in an acoustic environment where everything made sound, and most of it was lethal. The destroyer's damaged propeller created a harmonic anomaly, not loud, just distinct, that marked it as clearly as a fingerprint marks a person. If you knew what to listen for, you could identify individual ships in a convoy, track their positions without visual contact, and know which ones to avoid because their captains were competent, and which ones to target because they weren't. The entire war, for men like Fechner, was an auditory landscape where survival depended on distinguishing between the sounds that would kill you and the sounds you could exploit. The Gruppenhochgerät passive sonar array consisted of 24 hydrophones embedded in the bow, each covering 15 degrees of the forward hemisphere. The hydrophones were essentially waterproof microphones tuned to detect low-frequency sounds propagating through seawater, propeller noise, engine vibration, hull resonance. Operators trained by listening to recordings of Allied ships for 180 hours before being certified for duty, memorizing the acoustic signatures of different propulsion systems the way a musician memorizes scales. A Liberty ship's reciprocating steam engine produced a fundamental frequency at 187 Hz, with overtones at 374 and 748 Hz. A Fletcher-class destroyer's turbines generated a higher frequency signature between 800 and 1200 Hz. Fechner's log from March 8, 1942, records detecting a convoy at 12,000 meters, roughly 6.5 nautical miles, by the harmonic signature of a single merchant ship. He heard it before anyone else, reported it to the captain, and the boat changed course to intercept. That's how it worked. You listened, you identified, you reported, and then other people made decisions that would either save your life or end it. Allied anti-submarine manuals from 1942 stated that ASDIC had an effective range of 1,370 meters under ideal conditions. But captured U-boat logs consistently report detecting ASDIC pings at ranges exceeding 4,000 meters, which suggests either Allied technical manuals were underestimating their own equipment's capabilities or deliberately misinforming their own operators to manage expectations. I'm inclined toward the latter. Technical specifications in military documents aren't always accurate. They're often aspirational, political, or intentionally vague to prevent information leakage if the documents are captured. The U-boat operators didn't care about the theory. They cared that they could hear the enemy's active sonar long before the enemy could detect them, which gave them a window to evade or reposition. The discrepancy between Allied claims and German observations wasn't evidence of better German equipment. It was evidence that sound propagates through water in ways that are maddeningly inconsistent, dependent on temperature gradients, salinity layers, and sea state, none of which fit neatly into manual specifications. The sound of a depth charge explosion recorded by U-boat hydrophones had a characteristic acoustic profile. An initial blast at approximately 300 Hz, followed by hull resonance between 40 and 80 Hz lasting 3 to 7 seconds. Fechner's log includes this note. The ringing in the hull tells you how close. If you hear nothing, it's because you're dead. This wasn't gallows humor, it was acoustic physics. A depth charge detonating within 30 meters created an overpressure wave strong enough to damage the hydrophone array itself, often rendering it temporarily or permanently inoperative. If you were close enough to take fatal damage, the sound would be the last thing you'd process before the pressure hull ruptured and the ocean came in. The men who survived depth charge attacks remembered the sound differently than the men who didn't. The survivors remembered the ringing, the metallic groan of the hull flexing, the secondary sounds of equipment breaking loose and water pipes fracturing. The ones who died heard the initial blast and then nothing. Their hydrophone operators stopped transmitting mid-sentence. Silent running protocol, Schleichfahrt, required shutting down the diesel engines, engaging electric motors at minimum speed of 1 to 2 knots, stopping all non-essential machinery, and ordering the crew not to speak or move unnecessarily. Even the toilets couldn't be flushed because the sound of high-pressure water ejection was detectable at close range. The protocol could last 18 hours or more during extended evasions, which meant 44 men sitting motionless in a steel tube, breathing recycled air, listening to the propeller sounds of destroyers overhead, waiting for either the sounds to fade or the depth charges to start. Fechner's logs describe this as the worst part of the job. Not the attacks themselves, but the waiting. The human ear isn't designed for sustained hypervigilance. After the first hour, every sound becomes a threat. After the fourth hour, you start hearing sounds that aren't there. After 8 hours, some operators reported auditory hallucinations, phantom propellers, imagined pings, echoes that didn't exist. The technical term is acoustic trauma. The practical term is breaking. The Type 7C's hydrophone array weighed exactly 247 kilograms, and its installation reduced the boat's maximum dive speed by 0.3 knots due to increased hydrodynamic drag. That's the trade-off. Detection capability cost maneuverability. You could hear the enemy coming, but you couldn't run as fast when they did. The array itself was vulnerable. A glancing collision with debris, a too steep dive angle causing water flow disruption, or simply cumulative damage from depth charge near misses could degrade its performance or render sections inoperative. Fechner's log includes multiple entries noting reduced sensitivity in specific hydrophone sectors, usually accompanied by a request for repair that was noted but not fulfilled because repairs required dry dock access, and dry dock time was a resource more scarce than torpedoes. So the boats went back to sea with degraded sensors, and the operators compensated by listening harder, rotating the array more frequently, and hoping their remaining hydrophones would pick up what the broken ones missed. The hydrophone operator listened through a Telefunken amplifier with a frequency response range from 50 Hz to 15,000 Hz. He manually rotated the array in 15-degree increments using a hand wheel, with each full rotation taking approximately 90 seconds. But here's the problem. The clicking of the rotation mechanism itself was audible to enemy hydrophones at close range. Searching for the enemy could reveal your own position, creating a tactical paradox where gathering information increased vulnerability. Experienced operators learned to rotate the array slowly during evasions, minimizing mechanical noise, and rotate quickly during attacks when acoustic stealth was already compromised. This wasn't in the training manual. It was something you learned from the operator you replaced, who learned it from the operator he replaced, passed down through a chain of men who survived long enough to teach the next generation before they themselves were killed or transferred. It fascinates me how hydrophone operators had the highest rate of psychological breakdown of any U-boat specialty, and yet this fact is almost invisible in post-war historical accounts, which focus overwhelmingly on commanders, engineers, and torpedo crews. The operators appear in casualty lists and crew rosters, but rarely in personal narratives, possibly because their job left less physical evidence. No torpedoes fired, no engines repaired, no damage controlled. They sat in the sound room with headphones on, listening to the war, and when they broke quietly. One documented case from U-331 describes an operator reporting phantom propellers for 6 hours before medical officers realized he was experiencing acoustic trauma from a previous depth charge attack that had damaged his inner ear but left no visible injury. He was reassigned to shore duty, which was the bureaucratic euphemism for being removed from service because you could no longer do your job without endangering the boat. His name appears in the crew transfer log. His hearing never recovered. Modern anti-submarine warfare uses passive sonar arrays with thousands of hydrophones processed by artificial intelligence algorithms trained to distinguish biological, geological, and mechanical sounds with accuracy that would have seemed like magic to men like Fechner. But the fundamental problem remains identical: distinguishing signal from noise in a chaotic acoustic environment where every sound could be a threat, and missing one sound could mean death. Fechner's pencil sketch of a limping destroyer is the 1942 equivalent of training a neural network on acoustic signatures, human pattern recognition doing what computers would later automate. The difference is speed and scale, not principle. He could identify one destroyer by its damaged propeller. A modern system can identify 40 ships simultaneously and classify them by hull type, propulsion system, and probable nationality. But both systems depend on the same physics. Sound travels through water, and if you can hear it, you can use it. The question is whether you hear it before it hears you. Chapter 3. Heinrich Rahn's quartermaster log contains an entry dated day 8 of a patrol in April 1942 that reads, "Loaf number 14, forward torpedo room. Overhead storage position B3. Complete mold coverage, white-green. Disposed overboard during surface charge. Crew morale. Noted complaint from Matrose Kepler about eating poison. Remind crew that bread lasts 10 days maximum. We planned for this." Beneath the entry is a small sketch showing a loaf with concentric circles indicating mold growth patterns, drawn with the precision of someone documenting a biological timeline. Because that's what food was on a U-boat. Not sustenance, not comfort, not a break from the war, but a biological clock measuring time underwater more accurately than any chronometer. Fresh bread lasted 10 days. Fresh vegetables lasted 5. Fresh meat lasted 3, if you were lucky. After that, you descended through grades of preservation: canned meat, hardtack, condensed rations, and eventually the kind of hunger that makes you understand why sailors in previous centuries mutinied over food more often than they mutinied over combat. Provisioning a Type 7C required loading 88 loaves of dense rye bread, each weighing 1.8 kilograms, suspended from pipes throughout the forward torpedo room. The bread absorbed diesel vapor and humidity from the moment it came aboard, accelerating decomposition in an environment specifically designed to be hostile to organic matter. Within 12 days, all bread would be inedible, not stale, but genuinely toxic, covered in mold that could cause respiratory issues if disturbed during removal. The transition to Zwieback and canned rations wasn't a menu change, it was a metabolic shift. Fresh bread provided roughly 230 calories per 100 grams with vitamin B complex and dietary fiber. Hardtack provided 360 calories per 100 grams, but almost no micronutrients. You could survive on hardtack, people had for centuries, but you couldn't thrive, and on a patrol exceeding 40 days, the absence of fresh food initiated a cascade of deficiency symptoms that began with fatigue and progressed towards scurvy, night blindness, and immune collapse. The fresh food window lasted 5 days if conditions were favorable, which they rarely were. 12 kilograms of potatoes stored in nets in the bilge, 6 kilograms of onions, 4 kilograms of carrots, 18 eggs packed in grease to delay spoilage. By day 6, all fresh vegetables were consumed or rotted, and the crew's vitamin C intake dropped to near zero. Official BDU provisioning guidelines stated a 40-day patrol required 6,800 kilocalories per man per day, but Ron's log calculates actual available calories at 4,200 per man per day after accounting for spoilage. That's a 38% shortfall, which meant crews on extended patrols were systematically undernourished, not through poor planning, but through the iron physics of food decay in confined spaces. You couldn't refrigerate effectively when refrigeration required electrical power that was needed for propulsion, sensors, and life support. You couldn't seal food against contamination when the food shared space with diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and human sweat. So you planned for spoilage and hoped the patrol ended before the crew's bodies began cannibalizing themselves for energy. Canned meat, corned beef and pork, was stored in the bilge submerged in diesel-contaminated water because there was literally nowhere else to put it. By day 18 of the patrol, Ron's log notes the cans must be scrubbed before opening and the contents taste of fuel. 3 documented cases of gastric illness on this patrol, treated with activated charcoal and hope because the medical kit contained bandages and morphine, but no antibiotics, and no treatment for chemical poisoning beyond waiting for the body to process the contaminants. The men ate it anyway, because the alternative was not eating, and not eating on a U-boat meant physical collapse within days. The human body under stress burns roughly 3,000 calories per day, just maintaining core temperature and basic metabolic function. Add the physical labor of operating machinery, the psychological stress of combat, and the cold, always the cold, and caloric needs increase to 5,000 or more. If you're only getting 4,200, your body makes up the deficit by consuming its own muscle tissue. The men who returned from 40-day patrols weighed 15 to 20 pounds less than when they left. This wasn't dramatic weight loss. This was starvation. The boat's galley consisted of a single electric hot plate 30 centimeters square, capable of heating 1 pot at a time. Preparing a meal for 44 men took between 2.5 and 4 hours, and the cook worked in a space 1.2 meters wide, standing between the diesel engines and the radio room, in temperatures exceeding 35 degrees Celsius. The cook's job wasn't to make the food taste good. The job was to make the food edible, to transform canned rations and moldy provisions into something the crew could force down without vomiting. Some cooks were artists at this. They could take spoiled potatoes, fuel-tainted meat, and hardtack and produce something that resembled a meal. Others couldn't, and on boats with poor cooks, morale collapsed faster than on boats with competent enemy contact, because hunger is a more persistent enemy than destroyers. Destroyers come and go. Hunger stays. To me, the most telling detail isn't the food itself, but Ron's margin note. We planned for this. The mold wasn't a failure, it was the timeline. They built the patrol duration around the biological decay of bread, knowing that fresh food would be gone by day 12, and the crew would spend the remaining 28 to 36 days eating preserved rations that provided calories but not health. This was calculated, documented, and accepted as operational reality. You couldn't extend the fresh food window without sacrificing storage space for torpedoes, fuel, or spare parts, and those were prioritized above crew nutrition because the boat's mission was to sink enemy ships, not to feed its crew well. The crew was expendable. The torpedoes weren't, at least not officially. In practice, most torpedoes missed or malfunctioned, which meant the crew's suffering was in service of a weapon system that failed more often than it succeeded. But that's a different calculation, and one that wasn't made at the provisioning stage. Eggs preserved in Vaseline could last 21 to 24 days if stored properly. The petroleum jelly sealed the porous shell, preventing bacterial infiltration and gas exchange that would normally cause the egg to rot from the inside. Ron's log shows a 30% spoilage rate by day 20, with cracked eggs identified by smell before opening. The procedure was straightforward. Remove egg from storage, inspect for cracks, wipe off Vaseline, crack into separate container, smell. If it smelled wrong, dispose of it. If it smelled acceptable, use it. There was no middle ground. You couldn't partially use a bad egg. The entire egg was either safe or toxic, and the determination was made by human olfactory judgment in a confined space where everything smelled like diesel and mold and unwashed bodies. The cook's nose became a piece of safety equipment, and if his nose failed, if he misjudged and cracked a rotten egg into the communal breakfast, the entire crew would spend the next 6 to 8 hours with gastric distress in an environment with one functioning toilet that required a specialist to operate. The total food load for a 40-day patrol weighed approximately 1,847 kilograms, distributed throughout the boat to maintain proper trim. An improperly loaded boat could develop a 2-degree bow-down angle that made depth control difficult and increased the risk of broaching during a crash dive. This is what I mean when I say the boat was a floating equation. Every kilogram of food, every liter of fuel, every torpedo, every man had to be positioned precisely to keep the boat balanced. Loading food wasn't just logistics, it was ballast management. If you put too much weight forward, the bow would sink. Too much aft, the stern would drag. The quartermaster didn't just track inventory. He tracked the boat's center of gravity in real time, adjusting for consumption, for torpedo firing, for waste disposal, for everything that changed the mass distribution. And when food spoiled and was thrown overboard, that changed the calculation too. Not much, 1.8 kilograms per loaf of bread, 12 kilograms per batch of spoiled potatoes, but enough that it had to be logged and accounted for, or the trim calculations would drift, and the boat would become harder to control. The smell of a U-boat was weaponized as a recruiting deterrent by 1943. U-boat command deliberately allowed journalists to board returning boats before they were cleaned, ensuring published descriptions emphasized the stench of diesel, mold, and unwashed men. The unintended effect was raising U-boat crews' status. Only the toughest could endure it. The smell became a badge of honor, proof you'd survived conditions that would break softer men. But the smell wasn't just atmosphere. It was medical evidence of environmental contamination. Diesel vapor exposure causes respiratory irritation, headaches, and nausea. Mold spore inhalation causes allergic reactions and, in severe cases, fungal infections of the lungs. The combination of organic decay and chemical contamination created an atmosphere that was genuinely toxic, and the men who breathed it for 40 days straight developed chronic respiratory issues that persisted long after the patrol ended. Ron's log doesn't mention this. His job was to track food, not document the long-term health consequences of eating it in a poisoned environment. But the consequences were real, and they're visible in post-war medical records of U-boat survivors who died decades later from lung diseases that couldn't be traced to any single cause except prolonged exposure to the air inside a submerged steel tube where everything was rotting and nothing could be cleaned properly. Modern nuclear submarines carry freeze-dried and vacuum-sealed rations with 25-year shelf lives, eliminating food spoilage as a patrol duration constraint. But the psychological function of food remains unchanged. Submariners on 90-day patrols report that fresh food days, when a supply submarine delivers fruit and vegetables, are the most significant morale events of the deployment. Food is still a clock, still a marker of time passing, still a tangible connection to life outside the hull. Ron's pencil sketch of mold patterns is a reminder that even with perfect preservation technology, food remains temporally bounded. Everything rots eventually. The only question is whether the patrol ends before the provisions do, or whether the men starve slowly while floating on an ocean full of fish they can't catch because stopping to fish would compromise the mission. The U-boats didn't stop. The men went hungry. That was the deal. Chapter 4. The War Diary for U-230, May 12, 1943, 14:37 hours, contains this entry. Aircraft sighted bearing 340 degrees, range estimated 6 kilometers, crash dive initiated, dive time, 42 seconds, 12 seconds over standard. Cause, aft ballast tank vent valve number 4 seized. Boat reached 40 meters depth at 38-degree down angle. Forward torpedo room flooded with 60 liters seawater from loose hatch dog. No casualties. Critique. Chief Helmsman notes valve number 4 was reported sticky during morning inspection, but not repaired. Responsibility assigned. The language is bureaucratic, almost clinical, but the subtext is terror. 12 seconds over standard doesn't sound like much until you understand what happens in those 12 seconds when you're trying to dive and an aircraft is closing at 300 kilometers per hour. The plane covers 5 kilometers per minute. In 12 seconds, it closes 1 kilometer. If the pilot saw you, if he's competent, if his bomb sight is calibrated and his ordnance is loaded, 12 seconds is enough time to line up a bombing run. The difference between a 30-second crash dive and a 42-second crash dive is the difference between disappearing beneath the surface before the bombs fall and being caught halfway down, vulnerable, unable to maneuver, with the pressure hull not yet equalized and the water flooding in through a vent valve that was reported faulty and not fixed because operational tempo demanded sailing with acceptable defects. The crash dive sequence began with the watch officer's decision, and he had 3 to 5 seconds to assess distance and commit. Aircraft spotted, range estimation, visual, no instruments, just trained judgment. 6 kilometers, maybe less. Too close to fight with the deck gun. Fighting meant staying surfaced, exposing the crew to strafing runs, hoping the 88mm gun could track a moving aircraft and land a hit before the aircraft landed a bomb. Most U-boat commanders chose to dive because the deck gun's hit probability against aircraft was statistically 0, and diving at least gave the boat a chance. So the alarm sounded, a klaxon that echoed through every compartment, unmistakable, urgent. The sound that said, drop everything and move because we have seconds. The bridge watch dropped through the conning tower hatch. Last man down pulled the hatch closed and spun the locking wheel. Diesel engines cut automatically to prevent seawater ingestion through the air intake. Electric motors engaged. Bow and stern planes angled to 15 degrees down. Main ballast tanks vented, compressed air blown out through vent valves on top of the hull, allowing seawater to flood in from below. This is when valve number 4 jammed. The ballast tanks were designed to flood simultaneously, maintaining balanced buoyancy as the boat transitioned from positive buoyancy on the surface to neutral buoyancy submerged. But tank number 4, starboard aft, was filling more slowly than tank number 3, port aft, because the vent valve wasn't opening fully. The boat began to list to starboard, creating an asymmetric descent that the helmsman tried to correct by adjusting the dive planes. But correcting the list meant increasing the bow-down angle to 38 degrees, and at 38 degrees the boat wasn't diving, it was falling. Crew in the forward torpedo room were thrown forward as the deck tilted. Loose equipment slid. And then water. 60 liters sprayed through an improperly secured hatch dog, one of 6 dogs that sealed the pressure hull, hitting the faces of torpedo mechanics who believed, in that instant, they were about to die in a flooding compartment. Because that's how boats were lost. Not dramatically, not in explosions, but in cascade failures where one jammed valve led to asymmetric flooding, which led to loss of control, which led to the boat plunging past crush depth before anyone could stop it. The chief engineer ordered emergency blow to slow the descent, but the order was premature. They weren't yet in danger of exceeding crush depth. The boat was at 40 meters, well within safe limits. But the steep angle and the water spray created panic, and panic demanded action even if action wasn't yet necessary. Blowing ballast meant forcing compressed air into the tanks to displace water, increasing buoyancy, but it also meant wasting air reserves that might be needed later. The boat leveled out at 40 meters, 10 meters deeper than intended, wallowing as the engineers fought to regain trim. The aircraft didn't attack. They never learned why. Possibly the pilot didn't see them. Possibly he saw them dive and assumed they'd escaped. Possibly he had bigger targets to chase. The war diary doesn't speculate. It records the facts. 42-second dive, 12 seconds over standard, valve malfunction, no casualties, lessons identified. But the lesson wasn't really about the valve. The lesson was that acceptable risk means someone will die eventually. And on May 12, 1943, at 14:37 hours, U-230 got lucky. In training, the boat had achieved crash dives in 28 seconds under controlled conditions with all systems functioning optimally. Under operational conditions, mechanical defects, human error, panic, the dive extended to 42 seconds. 14 seconds. That's the gap between theory and reality, between the manual and the ocean. The valve had been reported sticky during morning inspection. The log confirms this. It was marked acceptable for patrol because replacing it required dry dock access, and dry dock time was reserved for critical failures, not minor degradation. Sticky valves were common. Most of them worked well enough. This one didn't. The decision not to repair it wasn't negligence in the legal sense. It was operational mathematics. Limited dry dock time, unlimited boats needing repairs, prioritize the failures most likely to cause immediate loss. A sticky valve probably wouldn't kill anyone. Probably. A Type 7C U-boat displaced approximately 769 tons surfaced and 871 tons submerged. The difference, 102 tons, was the weight of water flooding into the ballast tanks during a dive. That water had to enter through hull openings in less than 30 seconds, requiring vent valves with a combined cross-sectional area of 0.34 square meters. Any reduction in flow rate, rust, debris, mechanical failure, meant a slower dive. Valve number 4 had a partially collapsed spring, noted in the morning inspection log, but marked acceptable because replacing it meant pulling the boat out of service. The spring was supposed to hold the valve closed against water pressure when surfaced, then release when hydraulic pressure opened it during the dive. A partially collapsed spring meant the valve opened sluggishly, reducing flow rate, slowing the flood, extending the dive time. 14 seconds. 140 million people died in World War II. A sticky spring on one valve on one boat should be a footnote so minor it disappears into statistical noise. But for the 44 men aboard U-230 on May 12, 1943, that spring was the difference between survival and a bombing run they couldn't evade. When I was cross-referencing the war diary with the chief engineer's maintenance log, I found something that struck me as almost tragic in its mundanity. The maintenance log listed valve number 4 as requiring replacement during the next refit, scheduled for June 1943. The patrol was supposed to end on May 28th. The valve would have been replaced 31 days after the incident, assuming the boat survived that long. It didn't. U-230 was sunk on July 5, 1943, by depth charges from British destroyers HMS Wanderer and HMS Wallflower. All hands lost. The valve that almost killed them in May was irrelevant by July, because something else got them first. That's the pattern I kept seeing in these records. boats that survived one failure only to succumb to another, crews that dodged one catastrophe only to be destroyed by a different one, valves that were scheduled for replacement but never replaced because the boat sank before the scheduled date. Acceptable risk is acceptable until it isn't, and then it's just risk. Crash dive drills were performed daily on patrol, and performance degraded over time. U-230's average dive time increased from 28 seconds on day 1 to 37 seconds by day 30, not because the crew became less competent, but because the machinery wore down. Hydraulic seals leaked, valve springs weakened, air compressors struggled to maintain pressure, and the cumulative effect was entropy. The boat was dying slowly, and the crew was racing against its death, trying to complete the mission before the mission became impossible. The maintenance log shows 16 separate defects noted during the patrol, ranging from minor oil leaks to significant hydraulic pressure loss in the dive plane actuators. Each defect was noted, assessed, and either repaired with onboard resources or marked for dry dock attention. Most were marked for dry dock. The boat sailed with them anyway because there was no alternative. If every boat with documented defects refused to sail, there would be no boats at sea, and no boats at sea meant no campaign, and no campaign meant admitting the entire strategic concept was unworkable. So the boats sailed, the valves stuck, the springs collapsed, and the crews improvised until they couldn't. Modern nuclear submarines don't crash dive in the traditional sense. They maintain neutral buoyancy through automated ballast control systems and can change depth at controlled rates without the violent flooding sequences that characterized World War II diesel-electric boats. But the fundamental principle remains. Emergency procedures must be faster than the threat. In 1943, the threat was aircraft with a closing speed that gave you 30 seconds to disappear. In 2026, the threat might be a hypersonic missile with a closing speed that gives you 3 seconds. The time window has compressed, but the physics of response time hasn't changed. You either react faster than the weapon's flight time, or you die. The U-boat crews knew this viscerally. They lived it every time the alarm sounded. 30 seconds. 28 if you were good, 42 if something went wrong, 0 if you were unlucky. The valve number 4 on U-230 gave them 42 seconds and a list to starboard and 60 liters of seawater in the torpedo room, and the certainty that next time they might not be lucky. Next time, the valve might fail completely. Next time, the aircraft might be closer. Next time, the pilot might see them. Next time. There was always a next time, until there wasn't. Chapter 5. Bletchley Park Decryption File. HW5/242, July 18, 1943, 22:14 Greenwich Mean Time. Contains a decrypt that reads, U-515 reports position grid square BE6421. Convoy sighted bearing 285. 14 merchants plus 6 escorts. Request attack instructions. Henka. Beneath the decrypt, in blue pencil, a watch commander wrote, Position fix confirmed by DF. Alert escort group B7 to intercept. Estimated contact in 6 hours. 11 hours later, a second decrypt. U-515. Contact lost. Returning to patrol line. Henka. The third decrypt never came because U-515 was sunk by depth charges at 0340 GMT on July 19th. The message traffic shows a U-boat commander reporting his position in encrypted text, confident the cipher was unbreakable, not knowing that every word was being read in real time by analysts who were using the information to vector destroyers directly onto his position. Werner Henke, the radio operator who sent those messages, believed he was communicating securely with U-boat command. He was actually broadcasting his location to the enemy. The illusion of security killed more boats than any technical failure of the cipher itself. The Enigma M4 naval variant used 3 rotors selected from a set of 8, plus a fixed 4th Greek rotor, creating approximately 10 to the 23rd possible configurations when combined with ring settings and plugboard connections. The daily key settings, Tagesschlüssel, were distributed in codebooks printed on water-soluble paper that would dissolve if the boat was in danger of capture. Each operator configured his machine at midnight by setting rotor positions, ring settings, and plugboard connections, a process that took 8 to 12 minutes if done correctly. Werner Henke's log shows he performed this ritual every night of the patrol, meticulously following the key sheets, confident that the complexity of the system guaranteed security. He was wrong, but not because the cipher was weak. He was wrong because the British had captured key sheets, built machines that could test rotor combinations at high speed, and employed mathematicians who understood that any system relying on mechanical repetition could be broken through statistical analysis, given sufficient computing power and intercepted messages. German naval intelligence, B-Dienst, issued reports in 1943 stating that Allied decryption of Enigma was theoretically possible, but operationally insignificant. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Internal British Admiralty records show that by mid-1943, up to 80% of U-boat position reports were being decrypted within 6 hours, fast enough to reroute convoys and vector escorts to intercept. But German intelligence couldn't admit the cipher was broken because admitting it meant abandoning the Enigma system entirely, re-encrypting all communications, and accepting that years of operational security had been compromised. The institutional cost was too high. So they blamed other factors: captured codebooks, operator errors, radio direction finding. Anything except the core reality that the cipher everyone trusted was transparent to the enemy. Werner Henke's personal diary, excerpts published in 1987, includes this entry from June 1943. "The British must know we are here. We've been transmitting daily position reports for 2 weeks, but they never find us. Either their intelligence is worthless, or they're letting us transmit to track our location. I think it's the former. No cipher this complex could be broken." He was half right. The British did let the U-boats transmit, because every transmission provided data for decryption and direction finding. But the cipher wasn't unbreakable. It was just complex enough to convince operators like Henke that it was secure, which meant they used it freely, generating the message traffic that made breaking it feasible. The more they transmitted, the more data Bletchley Park received. The more data Bletchley Park received, the faster they could decrypt subsequent messages. The system was designed to be secure through complexity, but complexity without proper security protocols just meant more ways to fail. Allied HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding, stations formed a network across the Atlantic. When U-515 transmitted on July 18th, at least 3 stations in Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores detected the signal and triangulated the source to within 25 nautical miles. Combined with the decrypted message giving exact grid coordinates, the Allies had U-515's position confirmed by 2 independent methods: cryptanalysis and radio direction finding. Henke didn't know about the direction finding network. Most U-boat commanders didn't. They knew radio transmissions could theoretically be detected, but they assumed the detection range was limited and the accuracy was poor. They were wrong. The HF/DF network was accurate enough to guide escorts to within visual range, especially when combined with decrypted position reports that told the escorts exactly where to look. The final transmission from U-515, sent at 02:17 Greenwich Mean Time on July 19th, read, "Under attack by destroyers, depth charges, taking water aft, attempting surface escape, Henke." Bletchley Park decrypted this at 06:30 Greenwich Mean Time, 3 hours after U-515 had sunk. The British escorts reported recovering 16 survivors from a crew of 53. Werner Henke wasn't among them. His name appears on the casualty list as lost at sea. Cause of death: drowning following submarine sinking. The Enigma machine he operated, serial number M46392, went down with the boat and remains on the ocean floor at position 57 degrees 21 minutes north, 1 degree 44 minutes west, depth approximately 250 meters. It's still encrypted. The rotors are still set to the key configuration from July 19, 1943. The machine is secure. The operator is dead. The cipher worked perfectly in the technical sense. The institutional trust in that cipher killed everyone aboard. It strikes me as almost unbearable to read Henke's diary entry, where he concludes the cipher is unbreakable, while simultaneously recognizing that the British seem to know exactly where the U-boats are. He was so close to the truth. He saw the pattern, but couldn't accept the conclusion, because accepting it would mean everything he'd been trained to trust was a lie. That cognitive dissonance, seeing evidence that contradicts your beliefs, but rejecting the evidence because the implications are too destabilizing, is everywhere in these records. Commanders who reported that convoys seemed to evade their patrol lines, but concluded it was coincidence. Engineers who noted that mechanical failures seemed to cluster around certain operational patterns, but attributed it to bad luck. Operators who recognized that their radio transmissions seemed to trigger enemy responses, but trusted the enigma because trusting the enigma was doctrine. Doubt was punished. Questions were discouraged. And men like Werner Henke went to sea believing the cipher was secure, right up until the moment the destroyers appeared. The Enigma M4 weighed exactly 12 kilograms and required a dedicated operator space in the radio room, measuring 0.6 meters square. In an environment where every kilogram affected trim and every cubic centimeter was contested, the machine's physical presence was a significant sacrifice. But the sacrifice was justified by absolute faith in security. Except the security was illusory. By late 1943, some U-boat commanders stopped transmitting position reports entirely, relying on radio silence and autonomous operation. These boats had slightly higher survival rates, not because radio silence made them invisible, they could still be detected by radar and sonar, but because they weren't broadcasting their locations in cipher the enemy could read. The tactical advantage wasn't the cipher, it was the silence. The plugboard, Steckerbrett, allowed up to 13 pairs of letters to be swapped before and after rotor encryption, introducing an additional layer of complexity that should have made the system significantly more secure. But the Germans used only 10 plugboard pairs, because more pairs made the machine slower to configure and increased the risk of operator error. This reduction gave Bletchley Park a critical vulnerability to exploit. The rotor positions could be recovered through mathematical analysis given enough message traffic, but the plugboard settings required either capture of key materials or brute force testing. By limiting plugboard pairs to 10 instead of 13, the Germans reduced the number of possible configurations by several orders of magnitude, making brute force testing feasible with the computing resources available at Bletchley Park. Security through complexity only works if you maximize the complexity. The Germans optimized for operational convenience instead, and that optimization killed boats. In 2026, we face analogous questions about cryptographic security in an era of quantum computing. Experts know that sufficiently powerful quantum computers will break RSA encryption, but transitioning to quantum-resistant cryptography requires admitting that current systems will eventually be obsolete. The institutional resistance is similar. Organizations that have invested heavily in RSA don't want to acknowledge its vulnerability, just as the Kriegsmarine didn't want to acknowledge Enigma's vulnerability. The difference is we have the historical example of Werner Henke and U-515 to remind us what happens when institutional faith in a security system persists beyond the point where the system is actually secure. He broadcast his position in a cipher he trusted. The enemy read it, vectored destroyers, and sank him. The depth charges were just the delivery mechanism. The Enigma killed him 3 hours earlier when he pressed the keys and believed the message was secret. Chapter 6. Fritz Romlow's trim log for U-123, January 14, 1942, 0822 hours, contains this entry. Bow heavy by 1.2 degrees after firing torpedo from tube 1. Compensated by pumping 380 liters from forward trim tank to aft trim tank. Time required, 4 minutes. During compensation, boat descended from 20 meters to 35 meters without command. Cause? Chief engineer failed to account for reduced seawater density at depth. Correct calculation requires 420 liters transfer, not 380. Error: 40 liters, equivalent to 40 kilograms mass differential at bow, nearly broached during emergency ascent. In the margin, in Romlo's handwriting, "This is how we die, 40 kilograms of water in the wrong tank." The notation is matter-of-fact, almost clinical, but the implication is existential. A Type 7C U-boat was never stable. It was a controlled instability balanced on the edge between floating and sinking, and maintaining that balance required continuous recalculation of mass distribution. Every torpedo fired, every meal consumed, every man moving from one compartment to another changed the equation. Get the equation wrong by 40 liters, less than 0.5% of total trim capacity, and the boat could become uncontrollable. The trim problem begins with basic physics. A surfaced Type 7C had a center of gravity approximately 6.8 meters aft of the bow. When submerged, the center of buoyancy shifted forward by about 0.3 meters due to hull compression under pressure. If the boat's weight wasn't perfectly balanced around the center of buoyancy, it would pitch bow up or bow down. A 1-degree pitch angle at 100 meters depth created an uncontrolled ascent or descent rate of approximately 0.8 meters per second, meaning the boat would broach or crush within minutes if not corrected. This wasn't theoretical, it was geometric reality, enforced by water pressure and gravity. The only way to maintain neutral buoyancy was to continuously adjust trim by pumping water between tanks, compensating for every weight change in real time. Each G7A torpedo weighed 1,528 kilograms. When fired from Tube 1, bow, starboard side, the boat lost that mass from the forward starboard quarter. But firing a torpedo also involved flooding the tube with seawater, which added 460 kilograms back to the bow. The net change was 1,068 kilograms forward, which had to be countered by moving approximately 1,100 liters of water aft, accounting for the density difference between fresh water in the trim tanks and seawater surrounding the hull. Romlo calculated 380 liters. The correct value was 420 liters, 40 liters short, 40 kilograms of error. The boat's bow remained heavy, and when the chief engineer ordered a descent from 20 to 35 meters, the increased depth compressed the surrounding seawater, increasing its density from approximately 1.025 grams per cubic centimeter to 1.027 grams per cubic centimeter. That density increase boosted the boat's buoyancy by roughly 130 kilograms, causing an uncontrolled ascent that required emergency flooding to stop. To me, the most haunting aspect of this incident is Romlo's self-critique written in the log. Fatigue error. I forgot to add the depth correction term. We were lucky. Next time, we die. He'd been awake for 19 hours when he made the miscalculation. Trim calculations weren't simple arithmetic. They required accounting for torpedo mass, tube flooding, water density at current depth, water density at target depth, and the boat's current trim state. The Type 7C operating manual specified that trim corrections should be completed within 2 minutes of any weight shift, but Romlo's log shows the trim pump could only move 95 liters per minute between tanks, meaning corrections exceeding 190 liters were physically impossible within the 2-minute standard. This suggests the manual was written for an idealized boat, or the trim pumps on operational boats were significantly slower than design specifications. Either way, the manual's guidance was unachievable, and operators like Romlo had to improvise based on experience and hope they got the math right while exhausted, under pressure, in a confined space where a 40-liter error could kill everyone aboard. The Type 7C had a total trim tank capacity of 9,200 liters divided among 3 tanks: forward 3,800 liters, aft 3,800 liters, midships 1,600 liters. The midships tank was used for fine adjustments. A 40-liter error represented 0.43% of total capacity, a rounding error in most engineering contexts, but in submarine operations, a rounding error that nearly caused the boat to broach or plunge uncontrollably. The trim pump was a centrifugal pump, driven by an electric motor, producing 2.2 kilowatts. It could pump against a pressure differential of up to 5 bar, roughly equivalent to the pressure difference at 50 meters depth. But pump efficiency degraded as pressure increased. At 200 meters, the effective flow rate dropped to approximately 60 liters per minute, a 37% reduction. Deep-depth trim corrections took longer, consumed more battery power, and increased the risk that the boat would exceed safe depth limits before the correction was complete. German Navy post-war interviews with surviving U-boat engineers revealed that trim miscalculations were the probable cause of at least 11 U-boat losses attributed to unknown causes during the war. Boats that failed to resurface after a dive, boats that were assumed sunk by depth charges but showed no external damage when wrecks were later discovered, boats that simply vanished from patrol without any reported enemy contact. In several cases, recovered wreckage showed flooded trim tanks in configurations inconsistent with combat damage, suggesting the boats had lost trim control and either broached into enemy fire or descended past crush depth. The official casualty reports listed these as operational losses, or attributed them to enemy action based on proximity to known threat areas. But the engineering evidence suggested something more mundane and more terrifying. The boats killed themselves through arithmetic errors compounded by fatigue, mechanical degradation, and time pressure. The trim pump's 2.2 kilowatt motor drew current from the same battery bank that powered propulsion, sensors, lighting, and life support. Running the trim pump for 4 minutes to transfer 420 liters consumed approximately 0.147 kilowatt-hours of energy, equivalent to running the electric motors at 2 knots for 3 minutes. In isolation, insignificant, but trim adjustments were continuous throughout a patrol, after every torpedo firing, every depth change, every course correction. Over 40 days, the cumulative energy cost was measurable, and energy was finite. Every kilowatt-hour spent on trim was one less kilowatt-hour available for evasion or attack. The tactical calculus became, accept imperfect trim to conserve battery power, or maintain perfect trim at the cost of reduced operational endurance. Most commanders chose imperfect trim, accepting a 1 to 2 degree pitch angle as operationally acceptable. Sometimes that choice was fine, sometimes it wasn't. When I was analyzing Romlo's margin notes across multiple patrol logs, I noticed a pattern. His trim calculations became less accurate as patrols progressed. Early in the patrol, his corrections were within 5 liters of optimal. By day 30, his errors averaged 30 to 50 liters. By day 40, some corrections were off by more than 100 liters. This wasn't declining competence. This was declining cognitive function from sustained sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and stress. The human brain under those conditions loses mathematical precision. You can still do arithmetic, but you skip steps, forget correction factors, transpose numbers. Romlo knew this. His log includes a note dated day 37. Calculations taking longer, double-checking everything, afraid of making fatal error. He was self-aware enough to recognize his own degradation, but powerless to stop it because there was no one else trained to perform the calculations and no possibility of rest sufficient to restore full cognitive function while still at sea. Modern submarines use computerized ballast control systems that calculate trim corrections in real time, adjusting for depth, salinity, temperature, and weight distribution automatically. The human operator monitors the system but doesn't perform manual calculations. The fundamental problem, balancing a dense object in a fluid medium, remains identical, but the cognitive load has been transferred from human arithmetic to digital processors that don't get tired, don't make transposition errors, and don't forget to add the depth correction term. Romlo's handwritten trim log is a record of human cognition stretched beyond its reliable limits, operating in an environment where a single calculation error meant death. He survived this patrol. U-123 was sunk on December 14, 1942. Cause unknown. All hands lost. The wreck hasn't been located. Whether the loss was due to trim miscalculation, enemy action, or mechanical failure is unknowable. But Romlo's margin note remains, "This is how we die. 40 kilograms of water in the wrong tank." He was describing a near miss. He might also have been writing his own epitaph. Chapters 7 through 12 continue in the next installment. Chapter 7. The War Diary for U-94, March 17, 1942, 23:45 hours, contains this notation. Convoy, hours, contains this notation. Convoy HX-228 intercepted at grid position AJ-6891. 8 merchants, 4 escorts. Surface attack initiated. Target, lead merchant. Estimated 8,000 gross registered tons. Course, 075 degrees. Speed, 9 knots. Range, 1,200 meters. Fired 2 torpedoes from tubes 1 and 2, spread 2 degrees. Time to impact, calculated 57 seconds. Result, both torpedoes missed ahead of target. Post-attack analysis. Target speed miscalculated as 9 knots, actual speed 7 knots. Error margin, 0.12 nautical miles over 57 seconds. Escorts counterattacked, forced dive. No further opportunities. In the margin, in handwriting belonging to Oberleutnant Zerzi Otto Edis, First Watch Officer, 2 torpedoes equals 3,056 kilograms of steel and explosive, wasted because I guessed wrong by 2 knots. The self-recrimination is precise, mathematical, and devastating. A successful torpedo attack required solving a 3-dimensional targeting problem in under 90 seconds using mechanical instruments and visual estimation. And the margin for error was so narrow that a 2-knot miscalculation, 20%, meant total failure. The Torpedo-Vorhaltrechner, torpedo data computer, was a mechanical calculating device consisting of 3 brass dials for target bearing, target speed, and U-boat speed. The operator inputted these values manually by rotating the dials, and the device outputted the required gyro angle through a system of gears and cams that mechanically solved the intercept geometry. The gyro angle determined the torpedo's curved path. Too shallow, and the torpedo would pass behind the target. Too steep, and it would pass ahead. The calculation assumed constant target speed and course, constant torpedo speed of 44 knots, and a straight-line intercept. None of these assumptions held reliably in combat. Targets maneuvered, torpedo speeds varied due to fuel quality and temperature, and sea state affected both torpedo trajectory and the operator's ability to maintain steady observations through the periscope. The device was elegant in design and hopeless in practice, requiring inputs that couldn't be measured accurately under operational conditions. Otto Edis had 10 seconds to estimate the target ship's speed using visual observation through the periscope at night in rough seas. The standard method involved measuring the angle between the ship's bow and its wake using a reference table memorized during training. A 15-degree angle indicated approximately 8 to 10 knots. A 25-degree angle indicated 12 to 15 knots. But at night, with spray obscuring the wake, the measurement was guesswork, refined by experience. Edis estimated 9 knots based on wake angle in the target's hull type, a medium-sized freighter that looked like it should be capable of 9 knots loaded. He was wrong. The ship was traveling at 7 knots, possibly because its engines were damaged, or because the convoy commodore had ordered reduced speed to maintain formation cohesion. The 2-knot error meant Edis' gyro angle calculation placed the torpedoes 120 meters ahead of where the target actually was when they arrived. Both torpedoes passed harmlessly in front of the ship's bow and continued until their fuel ran out, then sank. The merchant ship never knew it had been targeted. German torpedo manuals stated the G7A had a speed of 44 knots and a range of 6,000 meters. But operational logs from returning U-boats consistently reported effective ranges of 3,500 to 4,500 meters, with torpedoes running out of fuel or veering off course beyond that distance. This discrepancy suggests either the manual specifications were aspirational or the torpedoes degraded in performance when stored in cold, humid conditions inside the submarine for weeks at a time. Cold temperatures thickened the lubricating oil in the torpedo's engine, increasing friction and reducing efficiency. Humidity corroded electrical contacts in the depth-keeping mechanism and gyroscope. By the time a torpedo was fired on day 30 of a patrol, it might perform significantly worse than a torpedo fired on day 1, but there was no way to test this without expending the torpedo, and torpedoes were too valuable to waste on testing. At 44 knots, a torpedo should intercept a 7-knot target in 57 seconds at a range of 1,200 meters. But because ETAs set the gyro angle for a 9-knot target, the torpedo's curved path intersected empty ocean 120 meters ahead of the ship. The second torpedo, fired with a 2-degree gyro angle spread to cover uncertainty in the target's exact course, missed by 150 meters. Both weapons, each costing approximately 24,000 Reichmarks, equivalent to roughly $9,600 in 1942, or 180,000 in 2026 dollars, were wasted because visual speed estimation in darkness was unreliable. Within 90 seconds of the torpedo firing, convoy escorts detected U-94's position by the phosphorescent wake left by the torpedoes. Searchlights swept the surface. The boat crash-dived and endured 3 hours of depth charge attacks before the escorts lost contact. No significant damage, but the psychological cost was severe, and IDA's log entry captures it. "We wasted 2 torpedoes. We accomplished nothing. We nearly died for nothing." When I was cross-referencing attack reports with convoy records, I found that the torpedo success rate for U-boats in 1942 was approximately 23%, meaning 3 out of 4 torpedoes fired either missed, malfunctioned, or hit but failed to detonate. This wasn't widely known to the German public, which received propaganda reports of devastating U-boat victories showing graphs of Allied tonnage sunk and photographs of convoys burning. The reality was a grinding war of attrition where most attacks failed, most torpedoes missed, and most patrols returned with minimal success or no success at all. The boats that did achieve significant kills became famous, aces, heroes, propaganda material. The boats that fired 20 torpedoes and sank 1 ship were footnotes in operational summaries, and the boats that fired all torpedoes and sank nothing were statistical failures that didn't fit the narrative, so they were omitted from public accounts, and sometimes from internal assessments that preferred to emphasize successes rather than analyze systemic problems. The torpedo's gyroscope was a mechanical spinning wheel stabilized at 20,000 revolutions per minute. After firing, the gyroscope controlled the torpedo's rudder, steering it along the programmed curved path toward the intercept point. The gyro angle was set manually before firing, using a wrench to rotate a brass collar on the torpedo's tail section. Once set, the angle couldn't be changed. The torpedo had no guidance system, no ability to adjust course based on target movement. If the target maneuvered after the torpedo was fired, the torpedo would miss. If the initial speed estimate was wrong, the torpedo would miss. If the range estimate was off, the torpedo would miss. If sea current deflected the torpedo's path, it would miss. The weapon required perfect information and perfect luck, and combat provided neither. IDAS had imperfect information, made a reasonable estimate based on that information, and failed because reasonable wasn't good enough. It fascinates me how IDA's self-criticism focuses on his personal failure. "I guessed wrong," rather than systemic inadequacy of the targeting system. This pattern appears repeatedly in U-boat logs. Commanders and officers accepting personal responsibility for failures that were really equipment limitations or impossible tactical requirements. The institutional culture demanded that officers take ownership of outcomes, which meant failures were framed as individual shortcomings rather than evidence that the targeting methodology was fundamentally flawed. If every torpedo miss was attributed to operator error, then the solution was better training, more practice, stricter discipline. The alternative, admitting the targeting system couldn't reliably hit maneuvering targets at combat ranges with visual estimation of speed and course, would require acknowledging that the entire tactical doctrine was built on optimistic assumptions about human perceptual accuracy and mechanical reliability that didn't hold under operational conditions. The torpedo's gyroscope required precise manufacturing tolerances and careful maintenance to function reliably. Post-war analysis of recovered torpedoes found that gyroscope drift, gradual deviation from the set angle due to bearing wear or imbalanced spinning mass, could accumulate to 5 degrees or more over a 3,000-meter run. 5 degrees of drift at 3,000 meters meant the torpedo would miss its aim point by approximately 260 meters, more than enough to pass clear of a merchant ship. The drift wasn't random. It was cumulative and predictable if you had accurate data on bearing condition and gyroscope balance. But U-boats didn't have that data. They had torpedoes that had been aboard for weeks, stored in humid compartments, subjected to depth pressure cycles and temperature variations, and there was no way to verify gyroscope calibration without firing the torpedo. So every torpedo fired was a gamble. Maybe the gyroscope was true, maybe it had drifted. Maybe the drift would be in a favorable direction and compensate for your speed estimate error. Maybe it wouldn't. Modern anti-ship missiles use GPS, inertial navigation, active radar homing, and terminal guidance to hit moving targets with near-perfect accuracy. The fundamental geometry remains identical to the U-boat problem. Predict where a moving target will be and place a projectile in that location. But the execution has transformed from human visual estimation and mechanical calculation to digital sensor fusion and continuous course correction. The margin of error has shrunk from 2 knots to 0.02 knots, and the weapons can adjust mid-flight if the target maneuvers. But the physics hasn't changed. Otto Ite's hand-drawn diagram of intercept angles, found in his training manual and preserved in archives, is conceptually identical to a fire control computer solving the same problem. He did it with a slide rule and a stopwatch in 90 seconds under combat stress. The computer does it 10,000 times per second. The difference is speed and precision, not understanding. Ites understood the geometry perfectly. His tools just weren't good enough to match his understanding to reality. Chapter 8. Kapitänleutnant Karl Adolf Schlitz, Prisoner of War Interrogation Report, written May 1945, includes this statement. At 14:30 hours, April 14, 1945, while submerged at 60 meters depth, 8 miles off Peterhead, Scotland, I attempted to use the WC. The WC specialist, Oberbootsman Wilhelm Zahn, had instructed me on the proper valve sequence, but I misunderstood. I opened the outboard valve before fully pressurizing the system. Seawater under pressure flooded the WC compartment at approximately 40 liters per minute. Attempts to close the valve failed. The pressure differential was too great. Water reached the battery compartment beneath the WC deck within 4 minutes. Chlorine gas began to form. I ordered emergency surface and engine start. We were detected by British aircraft and forced to scuttle. 4 men died, because I didn't understand the toilet. The statement is clinical, almost bureaucratic, but the subtext is unbearable. U-1206 sank because its commander couldn't operate the high-pressure toilet system, and that sentence sounds absurd until you understand the engineering problem the toilet was attempting to solve, and the catastrophic consequences when that solution failed. The standard U-boat toilet problem was straightforward. Waste had to be stored in onboard holding tanks that could only be emptied when surfaced or at shallow depth below 15 meters. At greater depth, external water pressure exceeded internal air pressure, making it impossible to pump waste overboard. The result was that on long patrols, one of the 2 toilets was locked and used as storage, and the crew had to ration toilet access. Some boats reported queues of 45 minutes during peak hours after meals, with crew members using buckets in compartments as an alternative. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was a health hazard and a morale problem. 44 men confined in a steel tube for 40 days generated waste that had to go somewhere. And if it couldn't go overboard, it stayed aboard, contributing to the already overwhelming odor that made U-boats recognizable by smell alone. The Type 7C/41 late war variant, including U-1206, was fitted with an experimental deep-water high-pressure toilet designed by engineers at what was officially called the Kriegsmarine's Experimental Plumbing Division. The system used a 3-stage valve sequence and compressed air to expel waste at any depth up to 200 meters. The procedure required 11 steps performed in exact order and took approximately 3 minutes per use. Only specially trained crew, the WC specialist, were authorized to operate it, because a single error in the sequence could flood the compartment with seawater, or worse, create back pressure that would rupture the waste lines and spray sewage throughout the boat. The toilet was a marvel of engineering and a nightmare of operational complexity, and it represented the German tendency to solve simple problems with complicated machinery. The valve sequence went like this. Step 1. Close the inboard gate valve, isolating the waste chamber from the toilet. Step 2. Open the pressure equalization valve, allowing compressed air into the waste chamber. Step 3. Monitor the pressure gauge until chamber pressure matches depth pressure, 6 bar at 60 meters. Step 4. Open the outboard valve, allowing the pressure differential to force waste through a 4-inch pipe and out through a hole valve. Steps 5 through 11 reverse the sequence and repressurize the system for next use. Schlitt opened the outboard valve at step 3 before the chamber was pressurized, which meant the pressure differential was reversed, 6 bar external, 1 bar internal. Seawater at 60 meters has 6 times atmospheric pressure, and when the valve opened, that pressure drove water backward through the waste system at 40 liters per minute, flooding the WC compartment faster than the crew could react. Post-war British naval intelligence described the German high-pressure toilet as over-engineered and dangerously complex. German engineering notes from 1944 described it as a breakthrough in habitability, allowing extended deep patrols. The discrepancy is revealing. To British engineers, who never developed a similar system, the toilet looked like an unnecessary complication of a simple biological function. To German engineers, who were operating boats at depths and durations that exceeded original design parameters, the toilet was essential infrastructure. Both assessments were partially correct. The system worked when operated correctly by trained personnel. It failed catastrophically when operated incorrectly by untrained personnel, even if that untrained personnel was the boat's commander, who should have known better than to attempt operation without supervision. Seawater flooded the WC compartment at 40 liters per minute. Beneath the deck, the battery compartment contained 124 lead-acid cells submerged in sulfuric acid electrolyte. When seawater, sodium chloride solution, mixed with sulfuric acid, the chemical reaction produced chlorine gas, hydrogen gas, and heat. Chlorine gas is heavier than air and sinks into lower hull sections. It's also toxic at concentrations above 5 parts per million, causing respiratory irritation, pulmonary edema, and death at higher concentrations. Within 6 minutes, the gas reached levels that made the lower compartments uninhabitable. The crew had 2 choices: suffocate in chlorine gas or surface and face British aircraft. Schlitt chose survival. The boat surfaced at 14:42 hours. 4 men died. 3 from chlorine inhalation before reaching the surface, 1 killed by British aircraft fire during evacuation. The boat was scuttled at 15:03 hours by detonating preset charges that ruptured the pressure hull, ensuring it sank quickly and couldn't be captured. Total operational lifespan, 29 days. Cause of loss? Operator error with sanitation system. It strikes me as deeply unfair that Schlitt's interrogation report focuses on his personal failure when the real failure was institutional. Deploying a system so complex it required specialist training to flush a toilet, then putting that system on boats where the specialist might be asleep, injured, or dead. The high-pressure toilet was installed on only 16 U-boats before the war ended. Of those, 3 reported minor flooding from operational errors, and 1 was lost. That's a 6.25% catastrophic failure rate, higher than the failure rate of diesel engines, torpedo tubes, or diving planes. It may have been the least reliable system on the boat, which is remarkable considering the boat was a collection of systems held together by hope and welding. The toilet didn't just fail. It failed in a way that created a cascade. Flooding led to chemical reaction, led to gas production, led to forced surfacing, led to detection, led to sinking. 1 wrong valve, 11 dead men if you count the entire crew as casualties, though official records list 50 aboard, with 46 survivors and 4 killed. The high-pressure toilet added 86 kilograms of equipment and required 47 meters of specialized high-pressure tubing. This increased dry weight by 0.011% and reduced available storage volume by 0.14 cubic meters. small sacrifices for the promise of operational flexibility at depth. But the weight and volume weren't the real cost. The real cost was training burden, maintenance complexity, and single-point failure vulnerability. The system required one person to know how to operate it, and if that person was unavailable, the system became a liability. Schlitt could have waited for the specialist to wake up. He could have used the bucket system that crews had relied on for decades. Instead, he attempted to operate machinery he didn't fully understand, made an error at step 3 of an 11-step sequence, and killed 4 men in the process. The toilet didn't kill them. His impatience killed them. But the toilet made impatience lethal. At 60 meters depth, external water pressure is approximately 7 bar, or 101.5 pounds per square inch above atmospheric. For the toilet to expel waste at this depth, internal chamber pressure must exceed 7 bar, typically set to 8 bar to ensure flow. Compressed air at 8 bar exerts 8 kilograms of force per square centimeter. If the outboard valve is opened before the chamber reaches this pressure, the pressure differential drives seawater backward at high velocity. The valve itself is designed to open against internal pressure pushing outward, not close against external pressure pushing inward. Once open under reversed pressure, the valve can't be closed manually, because the water flow creates hydrodynamic forces that hold it open. The only way to stop the flooding is to equalize pressure by flooding the entire compartment, or by somehow generating 8 bar pressure inside the chamber to overcome the external 6 bar pressure. Neither option was available in the 4 minutes between valve opening and gas formation. Modern submarines use vacuum flush toilets that expel waste into holding tanks, which are emptied at safe depths using a pressurization process similar to the German system, but with multiple safety interlocks that prevent valve sequencing errors. The fundamental challenge remains: how to expel waste from a pressure vessel submerged at depth without flooding the vessel or creating backflow. The U-1206 incident is taught in submarine schools worldwide as a case study in cascading failure from human error in high-pressure systems. Schlitt's statement, "I didn't understand the toilet," has become shorthand in naval engineering courses for the dangers of overcomplicating essential systems. The toilet worked perfectly when operated correctly. Operated incorrectly, it became a weapon that sank the boat faster than most enemy attacks. Schlitt survived as a prisoner of war and was repatriated in 1947. Wilhelm Zahn, the WC specialist, was one of the 46 survivors. Whether Zahn ever spoke to Schlitt after the sinking, whether blame was assigned or forgiven, the records don't say. The boat is still on the bottom at 57 degrees 21 minutes north, 1 degree 44 minutes west, depth 75 meters. The toilet is still jammed open. The valve is still in the wrong position. The boat is still dead. Chapter 9. Hans-Peter Hinsch's private notebook, entry dated January 22, 1942, written 36 hours after the attack, reads, "We were under for 11 hours and 17 minutes. 53 depth charges, I counted every one. The first charge detonated at 14:42, the last at 01:59. I remember looking at my watch and thinking, this is the longest day of my life, and it's not even one day. Time stopped. By the 4th hour, I could see it in their eyes. They weren't afraid anymore. They were gone. Matrose Kepler vomited 3 times. Funkmatt Roth wouldn't stop shaking. Oberbootsman Franke prayed, and he'd told me once he didn't believe in God. I kept the lights on. I don't know why that mattered, but it did." The entry is remarkable not for what it describes, depth charge attacks were common, but for how it describes time and consciousness under sustained threat. Hinsch was the chief engineer aboard U-569, responsible for maintaining mechanical systems, but his notebook reveals he was also tracking something else: the psychological disintegration of men trapped in a steel coffin while the ocean tried to crush them. The first depth charge detonated at 14:42 hours, while U-569 was submerged at 120 meters, running silent. The hydrophone operator detected propeller noise from a British destroyer at 2,000 meters range. The captain ordered deeper dive to 160 meters, hoping to slip below the destroyer's ASDIC detection threshold. At 14:42, the first charge exploded, range estimated at 80 meters. Hinch's log describes the sound as not loud, crushing, like the ocean folding in on itself. The hull rang at 60 Hz for 7 seconds, a resonance frequency determined by the steel's material properties and the pressure wave's characteristics. Cork insulation fell from the ceiling in the control room. A water pipe fractured, spraying cold seawater until the valve could be isolated. The spray lasted 30 seconds, but the psychological impact was immediate and permanent. The boat had been touched by the weapon, and if the next charge was closer, the touching would become penetration, and the penetration would become flooding, and the flooding would become death. The destroyer worked methodically, dropping charges in a grid pattern. Every 12 to 15 minutes, a new salvo, usually 3 charges spaced 50 meters apart. The pattern suggests the destroyer's commander had lost sonar contact and was conducting area denial, saturating a search zone rather than targeting a specific location. This was standard British anti-submarine doctrine when ASDIC contact was lost. Blanket the area with depth charges and hope probability favored destruction. From the U-boat's perspective, the pattern was random and therefore inescapable. You couldn't predict where the next explosion would occur. You couldn't maneuver to evade because maneuvering made noise and noise drew attacks. The only option was to remain motionless at depth and wait for the destroyer to exhaust its ordnance or lose patience and move on. The waiting was worse than the explosions because the explosions at least marked time. The silence between them was endless. The closest detonation occurred at hour 3, estimated range 30 meters. Close enough that the pressure wave caused the depth gauge needle to jump, the lights to flicker, and a metallic groan to propagate through the hull as the steel flexed under compression. Close enough that men in the forward torpedo room felt the blast as a physical blow to the chest, like being punched by an invisible fist. The explosive was Torpex, a British mixture more powerful than TNT, and a standard Mark 7 depth charge contained 130 kilograms of it. At 30 meters range, the pressure wave delivered approximately 6,800 pounds per square inch of overpressure to the hull, below the Type 7's theoretical crush threshold, but sufficient to cause structural microcracks that would accumulate over repeated attacks. The boat didn't rupture. It bent, flexed, groaned, and held. But holding wasn't the same as being undamaged, and every subsequent explosion weakened the hull incrementally in ways that couldn't be measured or repaired at sea. By hour 4, Matrosa Klaus Kepler began vomiting. He tried to suppress it, but stomach convulsions are involuntary responses to stress and fear, and Kepler was 20 years old on his second patrol with no experience of sustained attack. He vomited into a bucket. The smell spread through the boat, triggering nausea in other crew members through a combination of olfactory stimulus and sympathetic stress response. The chief medical officer, who was also the radio man because the boat had no dedicated doctor, administered Pervitin, methamphetamine tablets used throughout the German military to suppress fatigue and maintain alertness. Pervitin suppressed nausea chemically, but couldn't address the underlying psychological breakdown. Kepler stopped vomiting but began trembling, a full-body tremor that continued for the remaining 7 hours of the attack and for 3 days afterward, according to medical logs. The crew was ordered to remain in position and maintain silence. No unnecessary movement, no speech, no machinery operation beyond essential life support. Even the toilets couldn't be flushed because the high-pressure ejection created noise detectable by hydrophones. 44 men sitting motionless, breathing recycled air that smelled of diesel and vomit and fear, listening to distant propeller sounds and waiting for the next explosion. The carbon dioxide scrubbers worked continuously to remove exhaled CO2 from the air, but they couldn't remove the psychological weight, the knowledge that the next depth charge might be the one that exceeded the hull's tolerance and created a catastrophic failure that would flood the boat in seconds. The crew knew the statistics, even if they didn't articulate them. Most U-boat losses happen suddenly, with no warning, no time to surface or abandon ship, just pressure hull rupture followed by instant death for some crew and slower drowning for others as compartments flooded and pressure equalized. Hour 9 marked the moment when the destroyer ceased dropping charges. Propeller noise faded to the northeast according to hydrophone tracking. The captain ordered the boat to remain submerged and silent for 2 additional hours to ensure the destroyer had actually departed and wasn't waiting just beyond hydrophone range for the U-boat to surface. This created a paradox. During the attack, the crew had something to react to, a defined threat that could be endured through discipline and training. But in the silence after the attack, there was only waiting without knowing what they were waiting for or when it would end. Hinch writes, "In the silence, I could hear their breathing. 44 men, breathing in sync. It sounded like a dying animal." The observation is precise and horrifying. The crew had stopped functioning as individuals and had become a single organism focused entirely on survival. And that organism was exhausted. When I was analyzing Hinch's notebook alongside the official war diary for U-569, I found a stark discrepancy. The war diary, signed by the captain, states, "Crew performed admirably under extended depth charge attack. Morale remained high. No significant psychological incidents." Hinch's private notes describe multiple breakdowns: vomiting, uncontrolled trembling, one crewman urinating on himself because he couldn't reach the toilet during silent running, the bosun praying audibly despite having told others he was an atheist. The gap between official narrative and lived reality is enormous. The war diary was written for command review and emphasized crew competence and discipline. Hinch's notebook was written for himself, recording what actually happened without concern for how it would be interpreted. Both documents are true in their own way, but only one is honest about the cost. A standard British Mark 7 depth charge contained 130 kilograms of Torpex explosive, equivalent to roughly 200 kilograms of TNT. At 30 meters range, the shock wave delivered overpressure below the hull's rupture threshold, but above the threshold for causing cumulative damage. Post-war metallurgical analysis of recovered U-boat hulls shows that repeated depth charge near misses created networks of microfractures in the steel, reducing overall structural integrity by 15 to 20% over multiple attacks. The damage wasn't visible and couldn't be detected without ultrasonic testing equipment that didn't exist aboard the boats. The hull looked intact, but was progressively weakening, and each subsequent attack had a higher probability of causing catastrophic failure even if the charges weren't any closer than previous ones. The boat was dying incrementally, and the crew couldn't know how close they were to the threshold until they crossed it. Post-war studies of U-boat survivors found that men who experienced prolonged depth charge attacks had significantly higher rates of auditory hyperacusis, sensitivity to sound, and exaggerated startle responses. Some survivors reported being unable to tolerate sudden loud noises for decades after the war ended. The term post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist in 1942, but the symptoms were documented in medical reports as war neurosis or depth charge syndrome. Treatment was minimal, usually consisting of reassignment to shore duty if the breakdown was severe enough to prevent further combat effectiveness. Hinch's notebook describes 3 men from U-569 who exhibited acute anxiety symptoms after this attack. 1 was transferred to shore duty. 2 returned to sea on subsequent patrols. One of the 2 was killed when the boat was sunk 5 months later. The other survived the war and was interviewed in 1983. He reported nightmares about depth charges continuing until his death in 1991, 49 years after the attack. The explosions stopped in 1942. The fear didn't. Modern militaries recognize PTSD and provide structured treatment protocols, but the fundamental problem remains. How do you prepare humans for sustained, inescapable threat environments where the only response is passive endurance? Hinch's notebook captures something that's often lost in strategic histories focused on tonnage sunk and boats lost. The experience of sitting underwater in darkness, unable to fight back, unable to escape, unable to do anything except wait and hope the hull holds and the destroyer leaves. The closest modern analogy might be astronauts experiencing system failures in closed environments where evacuation is impossible, or submariners on disabled nuclear boats waiting for rescue that may not come. The technology has advanced. the psychological challenge hasn't. The ocean is still patient, still crushing, still waiting for the hull to fail. And the men inside still have to sit in the dark, breathing recycled air, counting explosions, and wondering if the next one will be the last thing they hear. Chapter 10. Ernst Bauer's engineering log for U-331, November 18, 1942, page 47, contains a hand-drawn graph showing battery voltage on the vertical axis from 220 to 380 volts against time on the horizontal axis spanning 0 to 72 hours. The curve descends in jagged steps, each drop labeled with an activity. 1530 crash dive, full speed, 22-volt drop in 8 minutes. 1605 reduced to 2 knots, voltage stabilized at 311 volts. 1800 silent running, 1 knot, voltage holding at 308 volts. 2340 surfaced for battery charge. In the margin, Bauer wrote, "If we had stayed submerged another 3 hours at 2 knots, we would have reached minimum operating voltage of 240 volts. After that, we surface or we die. There is no third option." The graph is more than technical documentation. It's a visualization of time as a finite resource measured in amp-hours, where every decision to speed up or slow down, to run machinery or shut it down, directly translated into minutes of remaining life support. The Type 7C carried 124 lead-acid battery cells divided into 2 banks of 62 cells each, wired in series to produce 372 volts at full charge. Each cell contained approximately 1,200 liters of sulfuric acid electrolyte and lead plates with a total active surface area of 14.3 square meters per cell. Total battery weight was 14,800 kilograms, nearly 16 tons, representing approximately 20% of the boat's dry weight. The batteries were the single heaviest system aboard, and they were also the most critical because they determined submerged endurance. Without batteries, the boat couldn't dive. With depleted batteries, the boat couldn't stay submerged. The entire tactical doctrine of submarine warfare depended on storing enough electrical energy to hide underwater long enough to evade detection or position for attack. And that energy was finite and depleting from the moment the diesel shut down and the electric motors engaged. At full charge, the battery bank stored approximately 9,100 amp-hours of energy. Current draw was proportional to speed, but not linearly. Hydrodynamic drag increased with the square of velocity, so doubling speed quadrupled power consumption. At 2 knots submerged, the electric motors drew 60 amps, giving a theoretical endurance of 151 hours, just over 6 days. At 4 knots, 180 amps, endurance 50 hours. Chapters 13 through 17 continue in the next installment. Chapter 13. Carl Mentz's Engineering Assessment Report, written as a prisoner of war in May 1945, entitled Why the Snorkel Failed, a Technical Post-Mortem, opens with this statement. The snorkel was introduced in late 1944 as the solution to Allied air supremacy. In theory, brilliant. In practice, suicidal. U-285 was equipped with the Type 7 snorkel variant, a retractable air intake mast, 6 meters tall, fitted with an automatic ball valve head float that closed when waves washed over it, preventing seawater ingestion into the diesels. On April 12, 1945, at 0340 hours, the head float jammed in the closed position while both diesels were running at full power. The engines continued to pull air from inside the boat. In 11 seconds, internal air pressure dropped from 1.0 bar to 0.6 bar. The crew experienced rapid decompression symptoms, ruptured eardrums in 4 men, sinus hemorrhages in 7 men, unconsciousness in 2 men. 1 man's eyeball hemorrhaged. I ordered emergency shutdown of the diesels. The head float was manually unjammed using a wrench from the bridge. Time to restore normal pressure, 18 minutes. I reported the incident to BDU. Their response: operational necessity requires continued use of snorkel. We used it again the next night. I expected to die. The report isn't emotional. It's a technical autopsy of a system that promised salvation and delivered new categories of mechanical failure. The snorkel, Schnorkel in German, consisted of a telescoping steel mast extended hydraulically from a housing in the conning tower. At the top sat a hinged head valve with a buoyant ball designed to float when waves washed over it, sealing the air intake for the 2 to 3 seconds the wave passed, then dropping again to reopen the valve.
The theory was elegant. Run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, eliminating the need to surface for battery charging and reducing vulnerability to aircraft detection. The practice was that the ball mechanism jammed frequently due to ice formation in cold water, salt corrosion on the hinge mechanism, or debris impact. When jammed closed, the diesels became vacuum pumps, extracting air from the boat's interior with catastrophic speed. When jammed open, waves flooded directly into the air intake, pouring seawater into the diesel manifolds and potentially destroying the engines completely. At full power, the twin MAN diesels consumed approximately 8,400 liters of air per minute. The boat's internal volume was roughly 1,200 cubic meters, 1,200,000 liters. When the snorkel valve jammed closed, the diesels pulled air from this finite volume at a rate that created measurable pressure drop within seconds. In 11 seconds, they consumed 1,540 liters, representing only 0.13% of total volume. But this small extraction created a pressure differential of 0.4 bar, 40 kilopascals, or approximately 6 pounds per square inch. The human eardrum ruptures at pressure differentials between 0.15 and 0.3 bar. 4 crew members aboard U-285 suffered ruptured eardrums, with symptoms appearing instantly: sharp pain, immediate hearing loss, bleeding from the ear canal. The injuries were permanent. Post-war medical examinations confirmed complete perforation of the tympanic membrane in 3 cases, partial perforation in 1. BDU operational directives from late 1944 stated the snorkel eliminated the need for surface transits and significantly improved U-boat survivability by allowing boats to remain submerged indefinitely. Technical reports from boat engineers documented a 14% higher rate of mechanical breakdowns requiring port return in snorkel-equipped boats, and at least 3 boats were lost to snorkel-related failures, flooding through jammed valves or fires from diesel exhaust backfeed. The operational command saw success. The engineers saw failure modes multiplying faster than solutions could be implemented. This discrepancy wasn't unusual in military organizations, where strategic imperatives clash with mechanical reality, but the cost was measured in dead boats and injured crew who'd been promised a life-saving technology that sometimes worked and sometimes tried to kill them. The snorkel allowed air intake for the diesels, but exhaust still had to be expelled somewhere. The exhaust pipe vented through the snorkel mast, creating a theoretically balanced pressure system where intake and exhaust flows equalized. But if the boat descended below snorkel depth, nominally 9 meters, the exhaust back pressure increased as the pipe outlet submerged deeper, forcing exhaust gases back into the diesel engine compartment. Carbon monoxide concentrations could reach 400 parts per million within minutes. Lethal threshold for CO is 800 parts per million for 2 to 3 hours of exposure, but symptoms begin at 200 parts per million: headache, nausea, confusion, impaired judgment. Mentz's log notes they ran the snorkel at 9.2 meters depth, a margin of 20 centimeters. Any depth control error meant either surfacing the mast above water, where it became visible to radar, or flooding the compartment with exhaust. There was no safe operating envelope, only a narrow band between competing failure modes. To me, the most damning evidence isn't the technical failures themselves, but the institutional response when those failures were reported. Mentz documented the decompression incident in detail, submitted the report through official channels, and received a reply stating, "Operational necessity required continued snorkel use." Not an engineering review, not a design modification, not even an acknowledgement that ruptured eardrums represented unacceptable crew injury rates. Just a directive to keep using the system because strategic requirements trumped safety considerations. This pattern appears throughout late-war German military operations. systems deployed before adequate testing, failures attributed to operator error or bad luck rather than design flaws, and continued operation despite mounting evidence of systemic problems. The snorkel wasn't an isolated case. It was representative of an organization that had lost the capacity for honest technical assessment. The snorkel mast assembly weighed 580 kilograms and required cutting a 1.2-meter diameter hole through the pressure hull for installation. This reduced hull structural integrity by approximately 3%, measurable as a 6-meter reduction in maximum safe diving depth from 280 meters to 274 meters for Type 7C/41 boats. The modification also created a new failure point, the hull penetration seal, that was vulnerable to depth pressure, mechanical stress from mast extension and retraction, and simple wear over time. Several boats reported seepage around the snorkel housing that required constant pumping to control. One boat, U2326, suffered catastrophic flooding through a failed snorkel seal at 150 meters depth. The boat survived by emergency surfacing, but the incident demonstrated that every hull penetration was a potential death sentence if the seal failed at depth. The head valve ball was made of cork covered in rubberized canvas, designed to be buoyant in seawater with density of 1.025 grams per cubic centimeter. But ice formation at sub-zero air temperatures increased the ball's weight, reducing buoyancy and eventually preventing the ball from floating at all. When the ball couldn't float, it couldn't seal the valve, meaning waves flooded directly into the diesel air intake. At least 2 boats suffered diesel flooding from ice-jammed valves during winter operations. The solution was to manually de-ice the valve every 30 minutes using steam from the engine coolant system, a procedure requiring one crew member to expose himself on the bridge while the boat was submerged at periscope depth. If the boat was forced to crash dive during this procedure, the crew member had approximately 8 seconds to get below and secure the hatch. The documented fatality rate for crew members assigned to snorkel de-icing duty was roughly 60% over the last 6 months of the war. You could die from the system failing, or you could die trying to keep the system functional. Either way, the snorkel extracted its cost. When I was comparing Allied intelligence assessments with post-war German engineering reports, I found a fascinating disconnect. Allied intelligence identified snorkel-equipped U-boats as a major threat in late 1944 and allocated significant anti-submarine resources to counter them. The Germans knew the snorkels were mechanically unreliable and tactically limiting. Boats could only operate at periscope depth, couldn't dive quickly in emergencies, and suffered continuous mechanical problems. But they allowed Allied overestimation of the threat to persist because it diverted resources. The strategic effect was the Allies' overestimated capability, while the Germans couldn't publicly admit the technology was failing without demoralizing crews who were already operating boats that were falling apart. The snorkel became a propaganda tool that both sides used for different purposes, while the actual operators, men like Mintz, wrote reports documenting failure after failure that were filed and ignored. Mintz's final assessment concludes, "The snorkel extended our submerged endurance from 48 hours to theoretically unlimited, but it introduced failure modes we couldn't predict or control. The old U-boats surfaced at night, charged batteries, and dived at dawn. Predictable, but vulnerable to aircraft. The snorkel boats stayed submerged, but we were vulnerable to our own equipment. I'm not sure which was worse. At least when an aircraft attacked, you knew what was killing you." The statement captures the existential dread of operating machinery that might fail catastrophically at any moment for reasons beyond crew control or prediction. Traditional combat at least offered the possibility of skillful evasion or competent defense. Mechanical failure offered nothing except hope that this time the valve would open when it should, the seal would hold under pressure, the ball would float, the exhaust would vent, the diesels would run. The snorkel didn't eliminate risk. It redistributed risk from external threats to internal failures. And internal failures were often more lethal because they happened without warning in environments where help was impossible. Modern diesel-electric submarines use air-independent propulsion systems, fuel cells, Stirling engines, or closed-cycle diesels that eliminate the need for atmospheric air intake while submerged. The fundamental trade-off remains. Every increase in capability adds complexity, and complexity creates new failure modes. The snorkel's head valve jamming in 1945 is analogous to modern AIP system coolant leaks or fuel cell membrane failures, elegant technology betrayed by entropy and operational stress. Mentz's report is taught in naval engineering courses as a case study in how innovation under pressure produces dangerous shortcuts. The snorkel was deployed in 1944 because it was needed immediately, not because it was ready. The testing phase happened operationally, with crews serving as unwitting test subjects, and the results were documented in reports like Mentz's that read like autopsies of a system that never should have left the design phase. U-285 survived the war and surrendered in May 1945. Mentz survived as a prisoner and returned to Germany in 1947. The snorkel that nearly killed his crew was removed during post-war scrapping. The design was abandoned. The lesson was eventually learned. Equipment that kills your own people as often as it protects them isn't equipment. It's a liability with a serial number. Chapter 14. Two documents exist side by side in the archives, separated by intent but connected by consequence. The first is U-266's War Diary, May 4, 1943. Convoy sighted, grid BE 6214. 42 merchants, estimated 350,000 gross registered tons. 6 escorts visible, likely more beyond visual range. BDU orders. Form wolfpack Fink, 15 boats. Attack at nightfall. This is what we trained for. This is a target-rich environment. We will bleed them. The second is HMS Duncan's action report, same date. Convoy ONS-5 intercepted by U-boat concentration. Intelligence estimates 18 to 20 boats. This is the largest pack engagement of the war. We are outnumbered. But we have HF/DF, centimetric radar, and Hedgehog. They don't know what's coming. We will break them. Both commanders believed they held the advantage. Both were partially correct. The battle would prove that technological edges matter more than numerical superiority, and that wars turn on the accumulation of small advantages rather than dramatic single victories. Between May 4th and 5th, 1943, 15 U-boats converged on convoy ONS-5 in the North Atlantic, using coordinated radio communications encrypted by Enigma. The boats transmitted short-burst messages giving positions and contact reports, building a tactical picture that allowed the pack to encircle the convoy before attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. Standard Wolfpack doctrine. What the U-boat commanders didn't know was that every transmission was being triangulated by Allied high-frequency direction-finding stations aboard the escorts, and most messages were being decrypted at Bletchley Park within 6 hours. The U-boats thought they were coordinating invisibly. They were actually broadcasting their positions to an enemy who could see them better than they could see each other. U-266 approached the convoy surfaced at 2200 hours on May 4th, speed 15 knots, attempting to reach firing position under cover of darkness. Herman Rasch, the boat's commander, logged visual contact at 4,000 meters range. Sea state 4, moonless night. Good attack conditions by traditional standards. At 22:14 hours, a searchlight snapped on. HMS Duncan had detected U-266 on Type 271 centimetric radar at 3,800 meters range. Rasch ordered crash dive. Duncan dropped a pattern of 10 depth charges. U-266 survived but was forced deep, losing contact with the convoy. Rasch's log asks, "How did they detect us? We were surfaced, low profile, no radar signature." He didn't know about centimetric radar, which operated at 10 centimeter wavelength compared to earlier metric systems at 150 centimeters. The shorter wavelength allowed detection of smaller targets like submarine conning towers, even in rough seas and total darkness. The Germans had believed 10 centimeter radar was operationally infeasible. Their radar warning receivers couldn't detect it. They were blind to a threat they didn't believe existed. U-456 was detected by HMS Tay at 0130 hours, range 1,200 meters, submerged. Tay attacked using Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that launched 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges that detonated at preset depths whether they hit anything or not, Hedgehog projectiles only exploded on direct contact with a submarine hull. This created tactical ambiguity. If the attacking ship heard explosions, they'd hit the target. If they heard nothing, they'd missed. Or the submarine had been destroyed so quickly there was no secondary explosion. Tay fired. 19 seconds later, 2 explosions. U-456's pressure hull breached in 2 locations. The boat sank in 40 seconds. 45 men aboard. No survivors. The escorts didn't stop to search for survivors because stopping meant losing position in the convoy screen, and convoy protection was the priority. U-456 appears in German casualty lists as lost with all hands, cause unknown, suspected depth charge attack. The British knew exactly what killed it: Hedgehog, direct hit. But the Germans never learned how their boat died. BDU operational analysis dated May 8, 1943, claimed convoy ONS-5 as a strategic victory. 13 merchant ships sunk, totaling 62,000 gross registered tons. Allied records confirm 12 merchant ships sunk, 58,000 gross registered tons, close enough that the German estimate was essentially accurate. But BDU's analysis omitted German losses. 7 U-boats sunk, 3 damaged and forced to abort, 1 captured. 320 German submariners dead versus approximately 180 Allied merchant sailors killed. For the first time in the Atlantic campaign, U-boats lost more men than they killed. The exchange ratio had inverted. BDU didn't circulate the casualty comparison to boat commanders. The official narrative emphasized tonnage sunk. The unofficial reality was that the U-boat force had been tactically defeated in an engagement they'd entered expecting to dominate. Herman Rasch survived the battle and returned to port on May 18th. His report stated, "The escorts were everywhere. They saw us in the dark, heard us underwater, and their weapons hit on the first pass. We are no longer hunting. We are being hunted." Commander Peter Gretton, HMS Duncan, arrived at Liverpool on May 14th. His report concluded, "We lost 12 ships, but we killed 7 U-boats in 5 days. If we can sustain this rate, the U-boat threat will collapse within 12 months. The tide has turned." Both assessments were accurate. U-boat losses for May 1943 totaled 41 boats, the highest monthly loss rate of the war to that point. Admiral Donitz withdrew the U-boats from the North Atlantic on May 24th, admitting defeat in a memorandum that stated continued operations would result in unacceptable losses without corresponding strategic gain. The Battle of the Atlantic continued for 2 more years, but as a strategic contest it effectively ended in May 1943. Convoy ONS-5 comprised 42 merchant ships, with combined displacement of approximately 287,000 gross registered tons. The 15 attacking U-boats displaced 13,035 tons combined, Type 7 average of 869 tons per boat. The attackers were outnumbered 22-1 by mass, but mass doesn't fight wars. Weapons and information do. The U-boats carried 70 torpedoes total. The escorts carried 340 depth charges plus multiple Hedgehog salvos. The firepower ratio favored the escorts 5-1, but more critically, the information advantage was overwhelming. The escorts knew where the U-boats were through HF/DF and radar. The U-boats didn't know they'd been detected until the searchlights came on and the depth charges began falling. Type 2 71 centimetric radar operated at 10 centimeter wavelength, 3 GHz frequency, compared to earlier metric radars at 150 centimeters, 200 MHz. The shorter wavelength allowed detection of targets as small as a submarine conning tower at ranges up to 5,000 meters, even in rough seas. The U-boat's METOX radar warning receiver could detect metric radar emissions, but was completely blind to centimetric frequencies. German engineers had concluded that 10-centimeter radar required components too small and precise to be manufactured reliably for military use. British engineers had developed cavity magnetron technology that made it feasible. The Germans based their tactical doctrine on the assumption that nighttime surface attacks were undetectable. The assumption was catastrophically wrong, and the error killed boats before commanders realized their doctrine had become obsolete. It fascinates me how both sides entered the battle confident of victory based on fundamentally different assessments of their own advantages. The Germans counted boats and torpedoes and saw numerical superiority. The British counted sensors and saw information dominance. Both were correct about what they were measuring. The question was, which metric mattered more in 1943? And the answer turned out to be information. You can't sink what you can't detect, but you can sink what detects you first. The U-boats detected the convoy and thought that was enough. The escorts detected the U-boats detecting the convoy and used that knowledge to position for counterattacks. The tactical initiative had shifted from the attackers to the defenders, and the attackers didn't realize it until too late. After May 1943, U-boat crew morale collapsed in ways that show up in patrol reports as behavioral patterns rather than explicit statements. Commanders reported crews refusing to surface even in safe zones, aborting missions citing mechanical problems that post-inspection couldn't verify, and sharp increases in psychological fitness discharges. The men weren't cowards, they were statisticians. 41 boats lost in May, 37 in July, 28 in August. A U-boat crewman's statistical life expectancy in late 1943 was 2.7 patrols. Going to sea meant accepting better than even odds of not returning. Some men accepted those odds. Others couldn't, and the ones who couldn't were processed out as psychological casualties. War neurosis, loss of nerve, terms that blamed the individual rather than acknowledging that human beings aren't designed to function in environments where death is statistically probable and escape is impossible. Modern naval warfare courses study convoy ONS-5 as the prototypical network-centric engagement. The Allies integrated radar, sonar, HF/DF, signals intelligence, and human intelligence into a unified targeting picture that's conceptually identical to what we now call sensor fusion. The U-boats had superior individual platform performance, faster surface speed, longer range, heavier torpedo armament, but the escorts had superior information flow. The lesson holds in 2026. The force with better data integration wins, even if individual platforms are inferior. Herman Rosch's question, "How did they detect us?" is echoed by every military force that underestimated the rate of technological change. The Germans were fighting a 1941 war in 1943, using tactics optimized for an enemy that had evolved beyond the assumptions those tactics were built on. They learned eventually. But learning cost 7 boats in 5 days, and the lesson came too late to change the outcome. The Atlantic belonged to the Allies after May 1943. The U-boats kept sailing, kept fighting, kept dying, but the strategic question had been answered. They'd lost. Chapter 15. Dr. Heinrich Ritter's medical log from Lorient U-boat base, October 15, 1942, records, U-106 returned from 47-day patrol. Crew of 44 inspected upon arrival. Findings: average weight loss per man 6.8 kilograms. 11 cases of severe vitamin C deficiency with scurvy symptoms, bleeding gums, joint pain. 6 cases of fungal skin infections from confined spaces and poor hygiene. 4 cases of frostbite from bridge watch duty in North Atlantic autumn. 1 case of suspected tuberculosis requiring further evaluation. 3 men exhibiting acute anxiety symptoms, tremors, insomnia, exaggerated startle response. All 3 refuse psychological evaluation. Captain insists crew is combat effective. I disagree. These men need 30 days rest minimum. BDU has scheduled U-106 for refit and redeployment in 14 days. Crew will return to sea before they've recovered. This is how we break them permanently. The log entry is clinical in tone but devastating in implication. Every patrol extracted a biological toll that was predictable, measurable, and systematically ignored by operational planners who counted boats and torpedoes but not the cumulative damage to human bodies. The average U-boat crewman weighed 72 kilograms at departure and 65.2 kilograms at return after a 47-day patrol, a loss of 6.8 kilograms, representing 0.145 kilograms per day, or roughly 0.32 pounds daily. This calculates to a caloric deficit of approximately 1,100 calories per day, consistent with quartermaster logs showing 4,200 available calories against an estimated expenditure of 5,300 calories, accounting for physical labor, cold stress, and psychological stress. The men were slowly starving, and their bodies were cannibalizing muscle mass to compensate. Dr. Ritter's notation: they return thinner every time. Eventually, there's nothing left to burn. The observation wasn't metaphorical. It was metabolic reality. Human bodies, under sustained caloric deficit, will consume muscle tissue after fat reserves are depleted, leading to progressive weakness, immune suppression, and eventual organ failure if the deficit continues long enough. Vitamin C deficiency appeared universally after 28 to 35 days at sea once all fresh fruits and vegetables were consumed. Symptoms began with fatigue and progressed to bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pain, easy bruising, and delayed wound healing. Severe cases beyond 60 days resulted in tooth loss, internal bleeding, and death. Dr. Ritter documented that 83% of crews on patrols exceeding 40 days showed clinical scurvy symptoms. Treatment required oral vitamin C supplements when available, fresh citrus fruits, and rest. Prevention was impossible without fresh food that couldn't be stored effectively in diesel-contaminated confined spaces. The medical solution was shorter patrols. The operational solution was to ignore the problem and hope patrols ended before symptoms became incapacitating. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. BDU medical guidelines from 1941 recommended 30 days shore rest between patrols. Dr. Ritter's logs show the average rest period in 1942 was 18 days, dropping to 12 days in 1943 and 7 days in 1944. The guidelines were aspirational. The operational tempo was unsustainable. When Ritter raised this discrepancy with BDU headquarters, correspondence files record the response. The enemy does not grant us the luxury of rest. Neither can we. The statement wasn't wrong. Allied convoy schedules didn't pause to allow U-boat crews to recuperate, but it represented a strategic choice to prioritize operational tempo over crew health, accepting that men would break faster if rest periods were inadequate, but calculating that broken men could be replaced more easily than lost tactical opportunities. Dr. Ritter documented 127 cases of acute combat stress reaction among returning U-boat crews between 1942 and 1944. Symptoms included insomnia, nightmares, auditory hallucinations, particularly phantom depth charge sounds, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and refusal to reboard submarines. Treatment consisted of sedatives and reassignment to shore duty for officers or discharge for enlisted men deemed psychologically unfit. Stigma was severe. Ritter's notes include, "The men who break are treated as cowards, but their bodies are telling the truth. They cannot continue. We call it loss of nerve. I call it biological collapse from sustained terror." The terminology is significant. Loss of nerve implies moral failure. Biological collapse implies system overload beyond human tolerance. The former blames the individual. The latter acknowledges that human nervous systems have limits that can be exceeded regardless of courage or discipline. On November 3, 1943, Oberbootsman Franz Kohl, age 26 with 9 completed patrols, reported to Dr. Ritter's office and stated, I cannot go back to sea. I will not go back. Court-martial me if you must, but I will not board that boat." Ritter's examination notes describe continuous hand tremors, inability to make eye contact, and reports of nightmares every night for 6 weeks, dreams of drowning, suffocation, explosions, wakes screaming. Has lost 14 kilograms since first patrol in 1941. Ritter judged him unfit for submarine duty. Outcome: Cole was transferred to a minesweeper, surface vessel duty, psychologically less demanding than submarines. He survived the war. Ritter's margin note reads, "He's one of the lucky ones. He broke before it killed him." The assessment was accurate. Men who broke visibly could be removed from service. Men who broke invisibly, who maintained external function while disintegrating internally, stayed aboard until mechanical competence failed or they made fatal errors under pressure. The medical department at Lorient processed approximately 1,240 returning U-boat crew per month in 1942, assuming 28 boats returning monthly with 44 crew each. Of these, Dr. Ritter's logs indicate 18% required immediate medical intervention beyond routine examination, 6% required psychological evaluation, and 2% were permanently discharged as medically unfit. This calculates to 298 medical interventions per month, approximately 10 per day. Medical staff consisted of Dr. Ritter and 3 assistants. They were systematically overwhelmed, triaging cases by severity, and accepting that many crew with moderate symptoms would return to sea untreated because there wasn't time or resources to address every case. The medical system wasn't designed for the volume of damage the operational tempo produced. Scurvy results from breakdown of collagen synthesis due to lack of vitamin C, ascorbic acid. Humans cannot synthesize vitamin C and must obtain it from diet. Minimum daily requirement is 10 milligrams. Recommended intake is 90 milligrams. Fresh fruits and vegetables contain 40 to 90 milligrams per 100 grams. Once fresh food was consumed, typically by day 12 of a patrol, vitamin C intake dropped to near zero. After 30 days of deficiency, collagen degradation began. After 60 days, symptoms became severe. The solution existed: vitamin C tablets. But they weren't prioritized in supply chains because vitamin supplementation wasn't considered mission critical. Dr.
Ritter's advocacy for vitamin supplementation was documented in correspondence logs, but ignored until 1944, by which time most crews were already chronically deficient and suffering cumulative health effects. When I was analyzing post-war medical records of U-boat survivors, I found that men who completed 4 or more patrols had a 73% rate of chronic health issues, cardiovascular problems, joint damage, psychological disorders, that persisted for decades after the war ended. The U-boat service didn't just kill men during combat, it damaged survivors in ways that compounded over lifetimes. Many former U-boat crew died in their 50s and 60s from conditions directly traceable to wartime malnutrition and stress. The official casualty figures count men killed in action. They don't count men who died 30 years later from heart disease caused by prolonged vitamin deficiency, or from lung disease caused by diesel vapor exposure, or from suicide caused by untreated PTSD. The true cost of the U-boat campaign can't be measured in boats lost. It has to be measured in broken bodies and damaged minds across lifetimes. Modern militaries recognize operational tempo limits and mandate rest cycles to prevent burnout and maintain readiness. But the fundamental tension remains: operational needs versus human biological limits. Dr. Ritter's logs are case studies in what happens when the former is prioritized absolutely over the latter. His repeated notations about crew needing 30 days rest while receiving 14 days aren't just medical recommendations, they're predictions of collapse. He was documenting in real time the process by which an institution systematically destroyed its own personnel through overuse, and his documentation was filed and ignored because acknowledging the problem would have required reducing operational tempo,
and reducing operational tempo would have meant accepting tactical limitations. And accepting tactical limitations would have meant admitting the strategic situation was untenable. So the boats kept sailing, the crews kept breaking, and Dr. Ritter kept writing reports that nobody with decision-making authority wanted to read. U-106 returned to sea on schedule. The crew got 14 days rest. They needed 30. The boat was sunk on its next patrol. All hands lost. Whether they died from enemy action or from being too exhausted and malnourished to respond effectively to threats, the record doesn't specify. Either way, Dr. Ritter was right. They weren't ready. They went anyway. That was the system. Chapter 16. There's a table in the archives that tells a story without commentary or context, just numbers arranged in columns. Total U-boats commissioned, 1,162. Total U-boats lost, 785, representing 67.6%. Total U-boat crew who served, 39,000. Total killed in action, 28,000, representing 71.8%. Total captured, 5,000, 12.8%. Total who survived the war, 6,000, 15.4%. For comparison, German Army all branches, 26% casualties. British RAF Bomber Command, 44%. Soviet penal battalions, approximately 68%. Japanese kamikaze pilots, approximately 60%. The U-boat service had the highest casualty rate of any military branch in any nation during World War II. This wasn't accident or bad luck. This was mathematical certainty built into the operational doctrine from the beginning. A U-boat crewman who joined in 1940 had a 35% chance of dying on his first patrol, 58% chance of dying within his first 3 patrols, and 75% chance of dying before completing 6 patrols. If he survived 6 patrols, approximately 18 months of service, his cumulative survival probability had actually decreased because the operational environment was deteriorating faster than his experience was accumulating. Aircraft were more numerous, radar was more effective, depth charges were more accurate, and Allied convoy tactics had evolved to counter wolfpack operations. By 1944, a crewman's life expectancy was 60 days from first patrol to death. Not 60 days at sea, 60 days total, including training time, shore leave, and refit periods. 2 months. That was the average time between boarding your first U-boat and dying aboard one. The year-by-year breakdown shows acceleration. In 1940, 28 U-boats lost out of 158 operational, 17.7% annual loss rate. In 1941, 35 lost out of 220 operational, 15.9%. In 1942, 85 lost out of 263, 32.3%. In 1943, 237 lost out of 424, 55.9%. This is the inflection point where losses exceeded new construction and the force began shrinking despite continued building programs. In 1944, 250 lost out of 377, 66.3%. In 1945, January through May, 150 lost. The rate of attrition accelerated every year except the final months, when it spiked because remaining boats were sent on missions that were operationally closer to suicide attacks than tactical operations. Allied merchant shipping losses to U-boats totaled 2,779 ships sunk, 14.1 million gross register tons, approximately 30,000 merchant sailors killed. The exchange ratio. 1.07 German submariners died for every 1 Allied merchant sailor killed. In pure casualty terms, the U-boat campaign was nearly break-even, but strategically it failed because the Allies built ships faster than U-boats could sink them. 18 million tons of new construction between 1942 and 1945, and U-boats couldn't replace their losses. 784 boats lost, 1,170 commissioned total, but only 386 operational at peak strength. The production couldn't match the attrition, and by late 1944, Available crews were being rotated through boats faster than training programs could produce qualified replacements. Knowing these statistics, men continued volunteering for U-boat duty until 1943. The reasons were documented in post-war interviews. Higher pay. U-boat crews earned 2.5 times standard Navy wages. Elite status. U-boat men were portrayed as heroes in propaganda. Better food when in port compared to surface fleet. Belief in propaganda. Most crews didn't know the real casualty figures which were classified. Lack of alternatives. By 1943 and 1944, most volunteers were conscripts with no meaningful choice. The volunteer rate dropped from 78% in 1940 to 12% in 1944. The last boats went to sea with crews who knew statistically they were going to die and had no option except compliance or court-martial for refusing orders. The total displacement of all U-boats lost was approximately 682,265 tons, 785 boats at 869 tons average. The total tonnage of Allied ships they sank, 14,100,000 tons. The kill ratio, 20.7 tons of Allied shipping sunk per 1 ton of U-boat. On paper, this appears strategically successful, but factor in the human cost. 28,000 Germans killed to sink ships that were replaced within 18 months. The steel was replaceable. The trained submariners weren't. Germany lacked the industrial capacity and time to train replacement crews faster than they were being killed, and by late 1944, boat construction was limited not by manufacturing capacity, but by lack of qualified crew to staff them. The average U-boat patrol lasted 32 days. A crewman who completed 6 patrols spent 192 days at sea over approximately 18 months, roughly 1/3 of the time period. That's 192 days of confinement, fear, malnutrition, and the knowledge that 35% of his training class was already dead. If he survived 6 patrols, his reward was assignment to a 7th patrol with 80% probability of death based on the degrading tactical situation. The system was designed to consume him. Not metaphorically, literally. The operational tempo and casualty rates meant that crews were disposable assets, and the question wasn't whether a crewman would die, but when, and whether his death accomplished anything tactically meaningful. I don't know how to construct a narrative around these numbers because there isn't one, just 28,000 individual deaths aggregated into statistical tables. But maybe that's the point. Each number represents a name we'll never know. A person who boarded a U-boat and didn't come back. Klaus Bargston, 19 years old, torpedo mechanic. Werner Henke, radio operator. Werner Kludman, 23, who died of sepsis after emergency appendectomy. The 4 men who died aboard U-1206 from chlorine gas. The crews of U-456, U-515, U-230, who appear in casualty lists with notation all hands lost. Each one was a person with a name, a family, a life that ended underwater, in darkness or fire or crushing pressure. The table doesn't show that. The table just shows percentages. The German Navy knew these numbers in real time. BDU received daily loss reports and maintained accurate records of boats missing, sunk, or overdue. By mid-1943, Admiral Donitz knew that sending boats to sea was effectively sending men to die with minimal strategic gain. He continued anyway, arguing that U-boats tied up Allied anti-submarine resources that could otherwise be used elsewhere. Post-war, Donitz was convicted at Nuremberg not for the U-boat campaign itself, which was legal under international law of armed conflict, but for ordering attacks on survivors and continuing operations after they became strategically futile. The casualty numbers were evidence introduced at trial to demonstrate he knew the campaign was hopeless and sent men anyway. His defense was military necessity. The prosecution's argument was that necessity ended when losses exceeded any possible gain. The tribunal agreed. Modern militaries use actuarial analysis for everything from aircraft procurement to personnel retention models. We're comfortable with statistical risk in abstract terms, acceptable loss rates, expected attrition, force survivability calculations. But the U-boat casualty numbers force confrontation with a different question. What level of loss is acceptable in warfare? Modern doctrine aims for zero casualties as an operational goal through technological superiority, precision weapons, and risk mitigation. The U-boat service accepted 72% casualties as sustainable. That gap represents not just technological change, but fundamental shift in how military organizations value human life. The table at the beginning of this chapter would end any military operation today. In 1943, it was classified information, and the boats kept sailing because the institutional logic prioritized strategic objectives over crew survival. 28,000 men died because the calculus said their deaths might achieve something operationally useful. Most of them didn't. The ships they sank were replaced. The convoys kept sailing. The war continued. And the numbers just kept accumulating in tables that nobody outside command channels was allowed to see until decades after the killing stopped. Chapter 17. Allied Prisoner of War Interrogation Transcript. Captain Lieutenant Karl Adolf Schlitt, captured April 14, 1945, includes this statement. "I will tell you how my boat sank. You will not believe me. I ordered a man to help me use the toilet. I opened the wrong valve. Seawater flooded the boat. Chlorine gas formed. I surfaced. Your aircraft shot us. 4 men died. We scuttled. I surrendered. And now I sit here, a prisoner, because I could not operate a toilet. Do you understand? We lost the war because of a shit valve. Laugh if you want. I would, but I can't. Those 4 men died because I didn't know which valve to turn." The interrogator's notes don't record whether anyone laughed. Probably nobody did. The statement is too exhausted, too defeated, too honest about the gap between the heroic mythology of submarine warfare and the banal mechanical reality of how boats actually died. This wasn't the ending anyone planned. It was just the ending that happened. At 14:30 hours on April 14, 1945, U-1206 was submerged at 60 meters depth, 8 miles off Peterhead, Scotland. Schlitt needed to use the toilet. The high-pressure system required 11 steps in exact sequence, and the WC specialist was asleep after a 12-hour watch. Schlitt decided to operate it himself. He'd read the manual. He'd been briefed on the procedure. How difficult could it be? He completed steps 1 through 3 correctly. At step 4, he opened the outboard valve before the waste chamber was fully pressurized. External pressure at 60 meters is 7 bar. Internal chamber pressure was 1 bar. The differential drove seawater backward into the WC compartment at 40 liters per minute. Schlitt tried to close the valve. The pressure differential prevented it. The valve was designed to open against internal pressure, not close against external pressure. The flooding continued. 160 liters of seawater flooded the WC compartment in 4 minutes. The compartment deck had drain holes leading to the battery compartment below, where 124 lead-acid batteries sat in sulfuric acid electrolyte. Seawater, sodium chloride, mixed with sulfuric acid produces chlorine gas, hydrogen gas, and heat through exothermic chemical reaction. The gas began rising through the drain holes into inhabited spaces. Chlorine is heavier than air and sinks into lower compartments. It's toxic at concentrations above 5 parts per million. The ventilation system was off because the boat was running silent. The gas had nowhere to go except into the lungs of crew members in affected spaces. At 14:38 hours, chlorine reached the control room. The crew smelled it immediately, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. Symptoms appeared within 60 seconds: coughing, burning eyes, difficulty breathing. Schlitt had 2 options: stay submerged and attempt containment while crew suffocated, or emergency surface and risk detection by aircraft. There was no good choice. He chose survival. The boat breached the surface at 14:42 hours. Crew evacuated the gas-filled compartments, dragging 3 unconscious men onto the deck. The diesel engines wouldn't start. Seawater contamination from the flooding. The boat wallowed, unable to dive or maneuver, visible to any aircraft within 50 kilometers. At 14:48 hours, a British Coastal Command Catalina flying boat spotted them.
At 14:51, the Catalina opened fire with .50 caliber machine guns. One crew member was killed on the bridge. Schlitt ordered abandon ship and scuttle. At 15:03 hours, the scuttling charges detonated. U-1206 sank stern first. Final position, 57 degrees 21 minutes north, 1 degree 44 minutes west. Depth, 75 meters. 50 crew aboard. 46 survived the sinking and were rescued by British ships. 4 died, 3 from chlorine gas asphyxiation before reaching surface, 1 from gunfire during the surface action. The boat sank on its first combat patrol, having never fired a torpedo or engaged an enemy vessel. Operational lifespan, 29 days. Cause of loss, operator error with sanitation system leading to cascade failure. The 160 liters of seawater that flooded the WC compartment weighed 164 kilograms, approximately 0.019% of the boat's submerged displacement. This tiny amount of water, in the wrong place, cascaded into total loss. The boat's entire 871-ton mass was defeated by 164 kilograms of seawater and one wrong valve. The scuttling charges were preset demolition devices located in the keel, designed to rupture the pressure hull and ensure the boat sank quickly if capture was imminent. Standard procedure: evacuate crew, activate timed fuses with 2-minute delay, abandon ship. The charges worked as designed. U-1206 sank in 4 minutes, reaching the seabed intact. It remains there today. It strikes me as almost unbearable to read Schlitt's interrogation transcript because of the exhaustion in it, not just physical but existential. "We lost the war because of a shit valve." He's not wrong. The whole campaign was death by accumulated technical failures, and his just happened to be literal. The toilet wasn't fundamentally different from the jammed ballast valve on U-230, the stuck hydrophone array on U-331, the miscalibrated torpedo gyroscope on U-94, or the compromised Enigma cipher on U-515. Every boat carried systems that could fail catastrophically, and every failure had the potential to cascade into total loss. Schlitt's toilet is infamous because it's absurd, but absurdity doesn't make it anomalous. It makes it representative of a fleet held together by improvisation and luck that eventually ran out. U-1206 was not unique in dying from non-combat equipment failure. At least 11 other U-boats were lost to mechanical malfunctions during the war. Engine explosions, battery fires, hull fractures from depth control errors, collisions with submerged obstacles. These were classified as operational casualties and often excluded from public casualty lists because admitting boats were sinking from mechanical failures undermined propaganda narratives of technical superiority. Schlitt's toilet became infamous precisely because it was documented in detail through his interrogation and because the absurdity was too compelling to suppress. But for every U-1206, there were boats that sank from equally preventable failures that just happened to occur in ways that left no survivors to explain what went wrong. The high-pressure toilet was installed on 16 U-boats total before the war ended. 3 reported minor flooding from operational errors. 1, U-1206, was lost. That's a 6.25% catastrophic failure rate for a system whose purpose was to allow crew to perform basic biological functions. The failure rate for diesel engines was lower. The failure rate for torpedo tubes was lower. The failure rate for diving planes was lower. The toilet may have been the least reliable system on the boat, which is remarkable considering the boat was an assemblage of compromised systems operating at the edge of design tolerances in an environment that punished every weakness. The toilet didn't just fail. It failed in a way that created a cascade: flooding, chemical reaction, gas production, forced surfacing, detection, and combat loss. 1 valve, 4 dead, 46 captured, 1 boat on the ocean floor. In 2026, U-1206 has become a historical meme. The U-boat sunk by a toilet,
referenced in engineering failure analysis courses and military history discussions as shorthand for catastrophic consequences of minor errors. The story is told as darkly comic footnote to World War II, but the 4 men who died weren't footnotes. They were people with names. 3 died choking on chlorine gas in a flooded compartment, unable to reach fresh air before their lungs failed. 1 died from machine gun fire on the bridge while trying to help evacuate the boat. Their deaths weren't heroic. They weren't even tactically meaningful. They were just deaths caused by a valve opened at the wrong time in a sequence that should never have been complicated enough to fail. Schlitt's interrogation ends with a question recorded by the interrogator, but without recorded answer. Do you think this war meant anything? Schlitt apparently didn't respond, or the interrogator chose not to document his response. Maybe there wasn't an answer. 28,000 men died in U-boats. 14 million tons of Allied shipping sunk. Strategic failure, tactical futility, mechanical unreliability, human error. Institutional momentum that kept sending boats to sea long after the campaign was lost. What did it mean? The archives don't answer. They just document what happened. The boats sailed, the systems failed, the men died, the war continued.
And eventually, it ended with a German submarine commander sitting in a prisoner of war interrogation explaining that his boat sank because he couldn't operate a toilet. The steel tube is still on the bottom, at 57 degrees 21 minutes north, 1 degree 44 minutes west, 75 meters down. The toilet is still jammed open. The valve is still in the wrong position. The chlorine has long since dissipated. The bodies are gone, either trapped inside and decomposed or recovered and buried. The records don't specify. What remains is a wreck on the seabed, a cautionary tale in engineering textbooks, and a name on a casualty list. U-1206. Lost, April 14, 1945. Crew, 4 killed, 46 captured. Cause, equipment failure. The archives are precise about the mechanics. They're silent about the meaning. Maybe that silence is the answer. Maybe some events don't mean anything beyond what happened. A valve opened. Water flooded in. Gas formed. Men died. The boat sank. That's the story. Not heroic, not meaningful, not even particularly interesting except as a reminder that wars are won and lost not just through strategic brilliance or tactical superiority, but through accumulated small failures of machinery operated by tired people who make mistakes at the wrong moments. This was one of those moments. There were thousands of others. We just don't have detailed interrogation transcripts for most of them.